The Ukrainian armed forces have liberated 554 settlements in the Kharkiv region. Less than 2% are still under temporary occupation by the Russian invaders.
Guten Tag und herzlich willkommen. Von einem einzigartigen historischen Moment sprach der ukrainische Präsident Volodymyr Zelenskyy am 23. Juni 2022. An diesem Tag erhielt die Ukraine den Status eines EU-Beitrittskandidaten verliehen von den Staats- und Regierungschefs der EU-Länder. Doch wofür steht dieser Status? Was würde gar die Mitgliedschaft der Ukraine in der EU bedeuten für die Ukraine, für die Europäische Union? Und
im Krieg in der Ukraine, da greift Russland weiterhin gezielt Energieinfrastruktur an. Die massiven Schäden führen zu einer kritischen Lage und zwingen die Ukraine nun zu landesweiten Stromabschaltungen, Susanne.
Deportation aus der Heimat. Auf Russisch wird den Ukrainern mitgeteilt, wo und wie es für sie langgehen muss. Raus aus der von Russen eroberten und erneut schwer umkämpften Gegend um Kherson im Südosten der Ukraine.
Mohammed Jemjun is in Kiew for us. And Mohammed, what more can you tell us about these Russian strikes on Ukrainian soil?
I'm Step Faster from the Jakarta Presidential Palace in Indonesia. For the first time, Indonesia holds the presidency of 20 of the world's largest economies known as the G20. The motto of the summit is Pulih Bersama Bangkit Lebih Kuat. Recover together, recover stronger. But with world powers divided over the war in Ukraine, is togetherness even possible? And what other challenges does the summit represent for Indonesia? Will Russian President Vladimir Putin attend? Some of the questions we put to the Indonesian President Joko Widodo talks to Al Jazeera.
Сколько у нас уже народу, девчонки? Мы их сразу оформляем, одеваем в готовности.
The Russian army is trying to get 300,000 new soldiers by the end of the month in what it's calling partial mobilization. Regular places have turned into draft centers. This Moscow theatre processes around 100 new recruits a day.
Russia mobilized about 200,000 people for the war against Ukraine. Such data was provided by the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Anna Maler. Resupplying the army continues in many Russian regions, often contrary to official regulations. So Timur Ismailov, one of the key IT specialists of Raiffeisenbank, was mobilized despite the fact that the Ministry of Digital Development of the Russian Federation granted a respite to employees in the field of information technology and communication. Pogukaev Andriy Ivanovich, place of birth the Luhansk region, Ukraine, Lytykhine district, village Uspenka, date of birth October 29, 19...
Russian army attacked cities of Lutsk and Kovel with Ka-101 missiles at 9 o'clock in the morning of October 22nd. They targeted at energy infrastructure facilities. All emergency services immediately arrived at the site. Police, rescuers and doctors. One person was wounded as a result of...
Hello everybody, today we have a very interesting guest and I hope our conversation will be very interesting because let me introduce my guest. It's William Broder, is a financier and political activist. He is a CEO and co-founder of Hermitage Capital Management, the investment advisor to the Hermitage Fund. And more of this, he is a publisher and he's a writer, and his new book is called Freezing Order. It's all about the true story of money laundering by Russian Federation and the true story of what's going on in the Kremlin, Putins and...
Die Welt von oben. Auch bei bewaffneten Konflikten geht heute kaum mehr etwas ohne Internet und Satellitenkommunikation. Die ukrainischen Streitkräfte nutzen derzeit das US-amerikanische Satellitennetz Starlink. Und die Ukraine ist auch sehr darauf angewiesen. Was können die neuen Satellitensysteme, was bisherige Kommunikationsanlagen nicht konnten? Und warum ist ganz besonders die Ukraine auf ein schnelles Netz angewiesen?
Good health to you, fellow Ukrainians. I held another meeting of the staff of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief on October 21st. The main points of the agenda are quite obvious. The protection of our skies from enemy missiles and drones. The protection of infrastructure facilities.
The Russian economy is just fine. At least that's the gist of what President Vladimir Putin said last week in a speech at an event in St. Petersburg. But are sanctions actually starting to bite? Or have they only served to blow back on Europe and America? Well, this is DW Business Q&A, where we'll ask the experts your question.
The Ukrainian government says Russia has launched a wave of airstrikes aimed at the country's civilian infrastructure. Reports suggest most missiles have been intercepted by air defence systems, but some have hit locations in the region of Lutsk, Rivne, Khmelnytskyi and Cherskiy. 5 missiles fired at the capital Kiev were shot.
Der Krieg in der Ukraine verursacht nicht nur menschliches Leid in ungeahntem Ausmaß, er hat auch Auswirkungen auf Natur und Klima. Warum genau und warum würden Lösungen in der Klimafrage genau dort liegen, im Schutz und der Kraft der Natur nämlich? Jetzt in SIP Magazin Klima.
The Ukrainian armed forces have liberated 554 settlements in the Kharkiv region. Less than 2% are still under temporary occupation by the Russian invaders.
Під тимчасовою окупацією лише, відповідно, 32.
Under temporary occupation only 32. This is just under 2% of the Kharkiv region. We are working on further strengthening the defense of the region because we understand that the front line has changed and we are actually building new defense lines now.
The Russian occupiers continue to attack already de-occupied territory. Since the beginning of the full-scale war, the Russian army has destroyed more than 12,000 facilities in the Kharkiv region. Every day, specialists are working to repair damaged facilities and eliminate consequences.
They went around, found the damage, made lists. Now we use these lists to drive around and repair the damage. It's been 3 days since we got electricity, 3 days since we got gas, and I can tell you civilization is appearing. We've already heated the house and it's getting easier to breathe. We've been waiting for 7 months and we have waited. Glory to Ukraine.
The priority now is to prepare for the heating season. Local authorities have to quickly solve problems, the issues that the occupiers did not even bother with.
On March 10th, everything was blown out and the windows too. We weren't hurt by the fragments, but my husband died after that. It was 3 degrees in the apartment at that time. My husband just froze.
In
the deoccupied settlements of the region, where there is no electricity supply yet, a reserve of equipment and fuel for alternative energy sources is being created. Also, means of individual heating for community residents are being produced and purchased.
Not only utility services, but also law enforcement officers are working in more intensive schedule here. There have already been 1,685 war crimes registered in the de-occupied territory of the Kharkiv region.
At the moment, there are 22 places of torture in the deoccupied territories. We establish them by the testimonies of witnesses of victims of torture. Currently, it is impossible to specify the total number of people who have gone through these tortures, because some of them are now in Russia. They have a place in Shebekino, where our military and police are held captive. There, the occupiers also tortured people. A few days ago, we removed the bodies of 2 tortured servicemen. We know for sure that they were taken out through Hoptivka in the direction of Belgorod and they returned back corpses.
More than 1,000 law enforcement officers control law and order in the liberated territories of the Kharkiv region every day. Mobile units of the Ukrainian Postal Service are working. People receive pensions and social benefits. Reported by Roman Smoler, Vlada Tsurkan, UATV News.
Ukraine-Krieg. Nachgehakt.
Guten Tag und herzlich willkommen. Von einem einzigartigen historischen Moment sprach der ukrainische Präsident Volodymyr Zelenskyy am 23. Juni 2022. An diesem Tag erhielt die Ukraine den Status eines EU-Beitrittskandidaten verliehen von den Staats- und Regierungschefs der EU-Länder. Doch wofür steht dieser Status? Was würde gar die Mitgliedschaft der Ukraine in der EU bedeuten für die Ukraine, für die Europäische Union und auch darüber hinaus? Mit diesen Fragen beschäftigt sich auch Barbara Lippert. Sie ist Forschungsdirektorin der Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik und analysiert, wie sich die Erweiterungspolitik der EU auf das Parlament, die Kommission und die Mitgliedstaaten auswirkt. Und in den vergangenen Monaten hat sie sich besonders um den ukrainischen Beitrittswunsch gekümmert. Guten Tag und schön, dass Sie da sind.
Guten Tag, Frau Kühn.
Ich habe es ja eben schon angesprochen. Ende Juni wurde die Ukraine offiziell zur Beitrittskandidatin der EU. Was hat sich denn dadurch geändert?
Der Kandidatenstatus ist für die Ukraine sowas wie ein Durchbruch in ihrer Europapolitik. Und für die Europäische Union ist es ein Wendepunkt in der Ukraine-Politik. Was will ich damit sagen? Die Ukraine ist über viele, viele Jahre auf taube Ohren gestoßen mit ihrem Mitgliedschaftswunsch in Brüssel, auf viele Vorbehalte gestoßen in den Mitgliedstaaten, auch in Deutschland. Der Angriffskrieg Russlands auf die Ukraine hat nun die Ausgangslage verändert. Die Europäische Union bewertet nun die Situation anders und revidiert ihre zurückhaltende Position und hat mit dem Kandidatenstatus ein politisches Signal gesendet. Einmal an die Ukraine, an die Regierung, an die Bevölkerung. Auch ein, wenn man so will, geopolitisches Signal an Moskau. Und das heißt vor allem, die Ukraine, wenn sie es will, hat eine offene Tür in die EU hinein. Die Ukraine gehört zum Westen. Die Ukraine ist nicht der Vorhof Russlands und auch nicht unsere Pufferzone zwischen EU und Russland. Insofern hat die Europäische Union tatsächlich eine Wende in ihrer Einschätzung herbeigeführt und eben anders reagiert als 2013, als ja die Proteste auf dem Maidan waren, die Revolution der Würde, die ja schon eine Manifestation war gegen die politische Intervention Russlands. Damals hat die EU der Ukraine angeboten bzw. mit ihr abgeschlossen ein Assoziierungsabkommen, eine enge wirtschaftliche und politische Verbindung, aber eben keine Mitgliedschaftsperspektive. Das hat sich nun verändert. Der Krieg ist ein Gamechanger. Was die Hausaufgaben angeht, wenn man das so sagen kann, die erfüllt werden müssen, um sehr nah an die Union heranzukommen oder sogar aufgenommen zu werden in die Gemeinschaft. Da hat sich eigentlich wenig verändert. Der Krieg natürlich multipliziert, potenziert die Herausforderungen für die Ukraine, vor allen Dingen im wirtschaftlichen Bereich. Aber ich würde gerne unterstreichen, dass in den Beziehungen Ukraine-EU man jetzt nicht mit dem Kandidatenstatus sozusagen bei Null anfängt, sondern dass es einen Vorlauf von etwa 8 Jahren gibt. Die Ukraine spricht selbst von 8 Jahren Reformkurs, sicherlich nicht linear, immer sozusagen Fortschritte gemacht, aber hier war die Orientierung in der Ukraine schon lange auf die Mitgliedschaft und ich würde sagen, dass die Implementierung dieses Abkommens von 2014 so etwas ist wie der Hauptweg, der Königsweg in die Europäische Union hinein, so etwas wie ein Fahrplan schon dafür bietet.
Trotzdem bedeutet so ein Kandidatenstatus heute ja aber nicht gleich die Mitgliedschaft morgen. Da braucht es ja noch ein paar Schritte.
Ja, die Europäische Union ist nicht die NATO. Wir sehen an Schweden und Finnland, dass die Aufnahme in die NATO, Verteidigungsbündnis, sozusagen auf einen großen Themenkomplex konzentriert, sehr viel schneller vonstatten geht. Die Europäische Union ist ein kompliziertes Gebilde, eine politische Gemeinschaft, vor allen Dingen aber eine Rechtsgemeinschaft. Und die Europäische Union hat Kriterien formuliert für die Aufnahme, die politischer Natur, wirtschaftlicher Natur sind. Und dazu gehört eben auch, dass neue Mitglieder den gesamten rechtlichen Besitzstand übernehmen müssen. Das ist also vom Verbraucherschutz über die 4 Freiheiten des Binnenmarkts bis zu Energieverkehrspolitik, das gesamte Paket, das ist enorm anspruchsvoll. Und die zurückliegenden Erweiterungsrunden haben gezeigt, dass wir jetzt so bei etwa 10 Jahren zwischen Beitrittsantrag und Aufnahme in die EU liegen. Es gibt Ausreißer wie die Türkei, die hat 1987 den Antrag gestellt und im Moment sind die Verhandlungen eingefroren. Also das ist ein Langstreckenlauf und die EU hat bei aller Solidarität, die sie mit der Ukraine zeigt, aber auch klar gesagt, Wir werden jetzt nicht diese Regeln, diese Kriterien aushebeln. Es gibt also nicht den schnellen Beitritt binnen weniger Monate oder auch nicht binnen 1-2 Jahren.
Was erhofft sich denn die Ukraine von einer EU-Mitgliedschaft?
Die Ukraine erhofft sich sicherlich Schutz, also die deutliche Zugehörigkeit zu den westlichen Demokratien, europäischen Demokratien. Sie erhofft sich sicherlich wirtschaftliche Entwicklung, Resilienz auch, was die wirtschaftliche und gesellschaftliche Entwicklung angeht. Sie erhofft sich mit Sicherheit auch finanzielle Solidarität. Die finanzielle Unterstützung für die Ukraine wird wegen der Kriegsfolgen eine ganz andere Größenordnung einnehmen müssen als die Unterstützung, die etwa Rumänien oder Bulgarien oder Kroatien, die letzten 3 Länder, die beigetreten sind, bekommen haben. Also das ist im Grunde genommen Wohlstand, Zugehörigkeit zu den Demokratien, Sicherheit in dem materiellen Sinne, wird die Ukraine durch die EU, wie sie heute aufgestellt ist, nicht bekommen können. Die EU verfügt selbst nicht über die Möglichkeiten, sozusagen für die Landesverteidigung oder für die Verteidigung der Gemeinschaft zu sorgen. Deshalb sind auch in den vorhergehenden Erweiterungsrunden die Kandidatenländer, die Bewerberländer in aller Regel zunächst der NATO beigetreten. Und das kompliziert nun die Verhandlungen mit der EU, mit der Ukraine in besonderer Weise, weil Sicherheitsgarantien, die die Ukraine existenziell braucht, nicht von der EU gegeben werden können. Das wird auch kein Gegenstand sein der Beitrittsverhandlungen. Hier müssen andere Wege gefunden werden. Und insofern wird diese Erweiterung oder zumindest dieser Prozess mit der Ukraine aus meiner Sicht sehr stark abgestimmt sein müssen mit den USA, der Führungsmacht in der NATO.
Schauen wir mal ganz nüchtern betrachtet darauf, bringt ein Beitritt der Ukraine der EU denn überhaupt was?
Die EU verhält sich zunächst einmal, ich sage jetzt mal, agnostisch. Sie sagt, jeder europäische Staat, der die Werte teilt der Gemeinschaft, kann einen Antrag stellen. Das heißt, Sie wollten ja eine nüchterne Einschätzung, das heißt, es gibt keinen Rechtsanspruch darauf. Und man muss auch sagen, das Ergebnis dieses mehrjährigen Verhandlungsprozesses ist offen. Es müssen am Ende die Mitgliedstaaten, nicht nur die Regierungen, sozusagen die Beitrittsakte unterschreiben, sondern das ist ein völkerrechtlicher Vertrag, der muss ratifiziert werden. Und hier ist nicht auszuschließen, dass es in den Parlamenten, in Deutschland wird der Bundestag und der Bundesrat zum Beispiel zustimmen müssen, dass in anderen Mitgliedstaaten die Parlamente nicht ohne weiteres zustimmen werden oder möglicherweise auch Volksabstimmungen abgehalten werden. Insofern ist also dieser Prozess mit vielen Fragezeichen verbunden.
Und es wird ja auch oft von der Aufnahmefähigkeit der EU gesprochen. Erwarten Sie da auch neue Herausforderungen für das Funktionieren der EU, für die Entscheidungsfindung in der Europäischen Union, wenn man die Ukraine aufnehmen würde?
Ja, das erwarte ich. Das ist aber jetzt nicht eine Erwartung, die sich jetzt im Speziellen an den Kandidaten Ukraine knüpft, sondern mit jeglicher Erweiterung ist immer die Frage aufgeworfen, ob die Funktionsfähigkeit der Union erhalten bleiben kann. Und hier gibt es einmal die institutionellen Fragen. Die Ukraine ist ein Land von der Größe so etwa zwischen Polen und Spanien. Die Union verhandelt absehbar mit bis zu 10 Ländern. Das heißt, das ist schon eine große Herausforderung. Und es gibt innerhalb der Europäischen Union 2 Lager. Ich würde sagen, das Erweiterungs- und das Vertiefungslager. Die einen sagen, Erweiterung kann auch mit einem Minimum an Reformen durchgeführt werden. So. Und das andere Lager sagt, wir müssen vertiefen, das heißt, wir müssen zum Beispiel zu mehr Mehrheitsentscheidungen in bestimmten Politikfeldern kommen. Der Bundeskanzler hat das jetzt am Wochenende auch noch mal hervorgehoben, dass es aus einer deutschen Sicht diese beiden Prozesse parallel verlaufen sollten. Macron, der französische Präsident, hat gegenüber seinen Botschaftern, die er im September in Paris zusammengerufen hat, gesagt, zum Beispiel die Europäische Politische Gemeinschaft wäre auch eine Möglichkeit, um die unendliche, die unbegrenzte Erweiterung der Europäischen Union zu stoppen, eine Alternative dazu zu bieten. Das bedeutet, innerhalb der Europäischen Union sind diese Fragen noch nicht ausdiskutiert und das wird ein großes Thema über die nächsten Jahre sein. Ich denke, in der Vergangenheit war die Erweiterung nur in sehr eingeschränktem Maße so etwas wie ein Hebel, ein Vehikel, um Vertiefungsschritte wirklich durchzusetzen. Insofern ist diese Hoffnung, dass mit der Erweiterung diese, ich sage jetzt mal, Reformblockaden sich auflösen, glaube ich, nicht gerechtfertigt. Und es bedarf sehr klarer politischer Führung und Entscheidungen, um diese beiden großen Herausforderungen wirklich angehen zu können. Das ist zum Nachteil der Länder, die beitreten wollen, weil sie darauf eigentlich gar keinen Einfluss haben. Sie sind da in der Hand der Europäischen Union, die auch die gesamten Verhandlungen im Grunde genommen dominiert. Es wird nicht im eigentlichen Sinne verhandelt, sondern es geht darum, wann seid ihr in der Lage, sozusagen alle Verpflichtungen zu übernehmen, dann habt ihr auch alle Rechte. Das ist im Grunde genommen der Ansatz der Europäischen Union. Und das ist für Kandidaten, die natürlich eine Menge von Herausforderungen zuerst mal zu bewältigen haben, sicherlich eine sehr schwierige Ausgangssituation.
Sie haben das ja schon erwähnt, die Ukraine ist ja nun nicht der einzige Staat, der Interesse bekundet hat, der EU beizutreten. Auch Moldau hat jetzt den Status eines Beitrittskandidaten. Was macht das denn aber mit den anderen Ländern, die auch schon länger gesagt haben, dass sie eigentlich in die EU möchten?
Ja, das Feld hat sich vergrößert. Das sind jetzt 10 Länder. 7 davon sind schon länger in diesem Prozess, 6 Länder des westlichen Balkans und die Türkei. Die werden sicher jetzt dieses Trio Ukraine, Moldau, Georgien als neue Konkurrenz ansehen, dass sie möglicherweise sogar überholen kann. Nicht zuletzt auch, weil insbesondere die Ukraine natürlich viel politisches, moralisches Kapital hat und sehr viel Aufmerksamkeit in den nächsten Jahren binden wird. Insofern könnte man sagen, also Wettbewerb wird angeheizt. Vielleicht wird damit auch eine Beschleunigung sozusagen der Annäherung an die EU, also dass die Länder selber auch mehr Fortschritte aus eigener Kraft machen wollen. Es könnte aber auch sein, dass die Länder ein größeres Interesse entwickeln an Zwischenstationen vor der Mitgliedschaft oder unterhalb der Mitgliedschaft. Und diese Zwischenstationen müssten dann aus dem eigenen Interesse dieser Länder heraus sich sicherlich auf den Binnenmarkt beziehen und auf finanzielle Unterstützung, also das, was wir in der EU als Strukturhilfe kennen. Das könnte ein Angebotspaket sein der EU.
Wir werden natürlich auf diese Entwicklung dann auch schauen. Barbara Lippert, vielen Dank, dass Sie hier waren bei Phoenix. Und Ihnen, meine Damen und Herren, vielen Dank für Ihr Interesse.
Und im Krieg in der Ukraine, da greift Russland weiterhin gezielt Energieinfrastruktur an. Die massiven Schäden führen zu einer kritischen Lage und zwingen die Ukraine nun zu landesweiten Stromabschaltungen, Susanne.
Ja, Ukraines Stromversorgung geht gerade in Flammen auf. Seit dem 10. Oktober beschießt Russland die Energieinfrastruktur mit Drohnen und Marschflugkörpern. Mittlerweile sind bis zu 40% der Anlagen beschädigt. Die Stromgewinnung wird also zunehmend schwierig und die Dunkelheit greift um sich. So wird Kaffee getrunken im Schein von Kerzen und Taschenlampen in Lemberg, ganz im Westen, oder eingekauft im Finstern während eines Stromausfalls in Kharkiv im Osten. Wie großräumig diese Stromausfälle inzwischen schon sind, das zeigen auch Satellitenbilder ganz deutlich. So etwa hat es in der Ukraine vor einem Jahr, also vor Krieg, vor dem Krieg bei Nacht ausgesehen. Hell erleuchtet sieht man da die Hauptstadt Kiew oder große Städte wie Dnipro oder Kharkiv. Und so schaut es jetzt bei Nacht aus. In weiten Teilen des Landes sind die Lichter ausgegangen. Zum Vergleich und zum Verdeutlichen noch einmal der Blick aufs Vorjahr. Die Lage ist also kritisch, die Schäden an den Anlagen sind massiv. Immer wieder muss der Strom landesweit abgeschaltet werden. Den Menschen droht ein harter Winter ohne Strom und Gas.
Es wird kälter in der Ukraine. In zahlreichen Regionen, vor allem entlang der Front, wie hier in Slowjansk, ist die Versorgung mit Strom, Heizung und Wasser schon seit Wochen eingeschränkt.
Hier kochen wir, seit wir keinen Strom und kein Gas mehr haben. Wir machen ein kleines Feuer. Das ist der einzige warme Ort, den ich habe.
In Ludmilas unbeheiztem Haus zeigt das Thermometer nur noch 13 Grad. Und der Winter steht noch bevor. Erste Probleme sind auch in der Hauptstadt Kiew zu spüren. Zeitlich gestaffelt wird der Strom bis zu 4 Stunden pro Tag abgeschaltet. Ein Teil der elektrischen Oberleitungsbusse fährt nicht mehr. Präsident Zelenskyy bittet die Bevölkerung, den Stromverbrauch auf das Nötigste zu beschränken.
Bitte schalten Sie keine unnötigen Elektrogeräte ein, verzichten Sie auf energieintensive Geräte.
Die Menschen nehmen diesen Aufruf ernst.
Wir haben alle elektrischen Geräte zu Hause abgeschaltet. Bisher haben wir die Heizung nicht benutzt.
Wir haben ein Wasserdepot und Kerzen. Wir sind zu 100% vorbereitet.
Denn wie Hunderttausende andere in der Ukraine wissen sie, dass eine harte Jahreszeit auf sie zukommt.
Deportation aus der Heimat. Auf Russisch wird den Ukrainern mitgeteilt, wo und wie es für sie langgehen muss. Raus aus der von Russen eroberten und erneut schwer umkämpften Gegend um Kherson im Südosten der Ukraine. Die Bahnhöfe in der Region quellen über. Züge und Busse im Dauereinsatz.
Heute sind bisher 10 Busse mit Flüchtlingen raus. Wir helfen dabei, so gut es geht. Manche wurden in kleinen Bussen weggebracht, andere wurden zu den Bahnhöfen begleitet.
Chersons russische Besatzer sagen, dass um die 50.000 Menschen aus der Region gebracht werden sollen. Sie nennen es eine freiwillige Evakuierung. Anders berichten die Deportierten. Wir wurden dazu aufgefordert, zu gehen, aufgrund der schwierigen Lage. Wir erhielten SMS-Nachrichten. Wir haben lange überlegt, wohin wir denn sollen. Aber dann haben uns Familie und Freunde aus Moskau angeboten, zu ihnen zu kommen. Wir gehen nun nach Moskau. Wir mussten weg aus Kherson, weil dort heftig gekämpft wird. Wir haben Angst um unser Leben. Wenn man dort in die Stadt geht, hat man nur noch Angst. Die meisten sind weg. Wer weiß, wo sie alle hin sind. Wir hoffen auf bessere Zeiten. Wir wollen in unser Kherson zurückkehren. Aber erst einmal landen viele der Deportierten hier, im Verteilungszentrum im Norden der Krim, im Ungewissen, wann und wohin es für sie weitergeht. Diese Zwangsevakuierung ist ein klarer Bruch des internationalen Rechts, so der UN-Sicherheitsrat in seiner Sitzung am Freitag. Die Dimension der humanitären Katastrophe ist erschütternd. Fast 18 Millionen Menschen, über 40% der Bevölkerung der Ukraine benötigen humanitäre Hilfe. Um die 14 Millionen Menschen wurden dazu gezwungen, ihre Häuser und Heimat zu verlassen. Doch Russland rechtfertigt seine Massendeportationen in der umkämpften Region um Kherson vor allem hiermit, dem großen Kachowka-Staudamm mit seinem riesigen Wasserreservoir. Russland behauptet, dass die Menschen, die in der Region leben, im Angesicht eines Angriffs der Ukraine gerettet werden müssten. Stattdessen, so die ukrainische Regierung, gäbe es Informationen, dass das russische Militär Damm und Anlagen, die sie im Frühjahr erobert hatten, vermint habe und einen Angriff unter falscher Flagge plane. Mit verheerenden Folgen.
Dieser Terroranschlag könnte zu vielen tausenden Toten und der Überschwemmung von vielen Ortschaften führen. Deswegen appellieren wir an die UN, die EU und andere Organisationen, eine internationale Beobachtermission an den Staudamm zu schicken. Internationale Experten sollten sofort zur Station kommen, zusammen mit ukrainischen Beobachtern.
Wie sehr russische Angriffe seit dem 10. Oktober kritische Infrastruktur treffen, zeigen auch diese Bilder aus der ukrainischen Hauptstadt Kiew. Nach Sonnenuntergang bleiben die Straßenlichter aus. Menschen versuchen mit Taschenlampen ihren Weg zu finden. Insgesamt, so die ukrainische Regierung, sei 1/3 der Stromversorgung bereits durch russische Raketenangriffe zerstört worden. Auch hier, so die Vereinten Nationen, ein klarer Bruch des internationalen Rechts. In Kombination mit den steigenden Gas- und Kohlepreisen führen diese Angriffe zu lebensbedrohlichen Konditionen im herannahenden Winter. Um es deutlich zu sagen, unter internationalem Recht sind solche Angriffe auf die Zivilbevölkerung und die zivile Infrastruktur verboten. Doch Moskau setzt seine Angriffe fort. Militäranalysten befürchten daher, dass das russische Militär den Staudamm Kachowka sprengen wird, um das Vorrücken des ukrainischen Militärs zu stoppen und ihren Rückzug aus der Region zu schützen. Die Massendeportation aus Kherson nach Russland oder in andere von Russland kontrollierte und völkerwidrig annektierte Gebiete befeuert diese Sorge nur noch mehr.
Well, Mohammed Jemjun is in Kiev for us. And Mohammed, what more can you tell us about these Russian strikes on Ukrainian soil?
Well, Tom, we've heard yet again in the past 10 minutes or so from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. He is now updating citizens throughout the country, saying that there are 1.5 million Ukrainian households without power at this hour. And he's saying that as a result of these massive Russian strikes that hit practically every region of this country much earlier today. Now, let me try to break down what happened earlier in the day for you. More than 10 Ukrainian regions experienced widespread power outages as a result of these Russian missile strikes. The national energy company, Ukrenergo, they had issued a statement a couple of hours ago saying that the latest attacks may have caused worse damage to the power infrastructure and the power grid in this country than the barrage of missiles that hit various Ukrainian cities on October 10th. And if you'll remember, October 10th was the day there had been the largest attack on this country from Russia since the beginning of the war this past February. Now, some of the regions that have been impacted by the missile strikes today include Rivne, that's in the west of the country, also Lutsk, that's in the west of the country. We're told large portions of Lutsk are without power, and that's because a critical infrastructure facility there was destroyed by missiles that struck it earlier in the day. Also, Odessa in the south, Sumy in the north, and in the center of the country, Kiev region, which is where the capital, Kiev, where we are now, is located, and Kirovograd in the center of the country as well. Now, as a result of all of this, there have been restrictions to the electricity supply that have been imposed throughout the day by the national power company throughout all of these regions. There is a lot of concern that there will be more blackouts in the days ahead. And we were also told by Ukrainian President's office that there were a total of 18 missiles destroyed today by air defense systems out of a total of 33 missiles that were fired into Ukraine. Tom?
Okay, what more can you tell us about these evacuations in Kherson that Russian occupation authorities are asking civilians to leave immediately?
Well, there hasn't been a lot of updates on that from the Ukrainian side. And the reason for that, Tom, is because there has effectively been a media blackout in place when it comes to the Ukrainian counteroffensive and what the Ukrainian forces are doing to try to recapture Kherson. This has been in place for close to a week now. I can tell you that when watching media figures here, when hearing from certain politicians, there is a sense that these folks are indicating that they believe that the Ukrainian forces are steadily advancing, that there is a belief here in Ukraine that the Ukrainian forces will be successful in recapturing at least part of Kherson. But again, it is a media blackout. We're not getting any kind of logistical updates, tactical updates when it comes to the movement of Ukrainian forces. We know from videos that we've seen purporting to show what's going on in Kherson that evacuations being carried out by the Russians are still taking place. We've seen these videos. We can't independently verify them. We know that there is concern among the Ukrainians because they don't call them evacuations in Ukraine. They say this forced displacement. So there is a lot of concern about what will happen to these citizens who are being evacuated. We heard from Russian officials a few days ago. They said that up to 60,000 people may be evacuated by the Russians into the Russian side. It seems as though now this is a much more dire warning from the Russians to try to evacuate residents as urgently as possible. Tom?
Okay, thank you very much for that update. That is Mohammed Jamjoon for us in Kiev. Well, the governor of Russia's Belgorod region says 2 civilians have been killed by shelling. Well, 15,000 people have been left without electricity after strikes on the region bordering Ukraine. Well, Ukraine has denied responsibility for several attacks carried out there since Russia's invasion began in February. Let's go to Mohammed Val in Moscow now. And what more can you tell us about this?
Yes, Tom, just as my colleague Mohammed mentioned about the blackout with regards to the specifics and the details of what happens at the front line, we also here have a similar situation. The Ministry of Defense, in its daily briefing, talks about the casualties or the damage it inflicts on a daily basis among the Ukrainian soldiers, speaking today about 130 soldiers killed somewhere and another 80 killed between Kherson and the Liman axes in different contexts. Trying also to tell the population here, the people of Russia, that the military are doing what they should do to push back the Ukrainian offensive at any occasion. In Belgorod, this has become a daily reality, the daily shelling, and the Ukrainians are not talking about it, but the Russians, on every occasion, they accuse the Ukrainian side of being behind those attacks. 4 days ago, there was an attack on an oil depot and also an attack on a power station that caused a blackout in the city. They said it was mended very quickly, but apparently from the reports today, the local authorities, the pro-Russian local authorities there have acknowledged that 15,000 people have gone without electricity and 2 people died, as you mentioned. So that city, because of that town, because it's very close to the border, it is only 40 kilometers from the border with Ukraine, the usual border with Ukraine before the annexation of that part of the land. And also it is 1 hour drive from Kharkiv, which is the Ukraine's second largest city. So it's very vulnerable and it's very, very close in the range of the Ukrainian rockets. And sometimes Ukraine in the past, it used helicopters even to attack locations there and infrastructure. So that city in particular is very vulnerable, as I said, and the Russians are seemingly, apparently unable to protect it. The same applies with the population of Kherson, as you mentioned there. That evacuation is going on, and today it has reached an excessive limit when they said everyone should leave, and that is seen by the Russian side as a measure to protect the population, but on the Ukrainian side it's seen as a transfer of civilians.
Okay, thank you so much. That is Mohammed Val for us in Moscow.
I'm Stefasa from the Jakarta Presidential Palace in Indonesia. For the first time, Indonesia holds the presidency of 20 of the world's largest economies, known as the G20. The motto of the summit is Pulih Bersama, Bangkit Lebih Kuat. Recover together, recover stronger. But with world powers divided over the war in Ukraine, is togetherness even possible? And what other challenges does the summit represent for Indonesia? Will Russian President Vladimir Putin attend? Some of the questions we put to the Indonesian President, Joko Widodo, talks to Al Jazeera. President Joko Widodo of Indonesia, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera. You have invited me to a very unusual location for a presidential interview, but we will reveal to the audience what the reason is why we are here later. But first I want to ask you about this very important international geopolitical meeting that you are organizing right now, the G20. And it's happening at a very, very difficult time globally. You have invited both President Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelenskyy of Ukraine. They have both confirmed that they will attend the meeting.
Until now, they still express their willingness to attend the meeting. The situation is not easy, and in addition, the rivalry that is present gets more and more pronounced. However, we still expect that Putin and President Zelenskyy will be able to attend this meeting to foster room for dialogue and to find solutions.
You have seen, of course, also the images coming out of Ukraine, civilians being targeted by the Russian military. Has it crossed your mind? Have you considered of expelling President Putin from the meeting? Because some leaders are calling him, they have accused him of committing war crimes. Have you considered him not inviting him?
It's a really challenging situation. It is not an easy matter. Setting up a dialogue space is also not simple. Since the rivalry is getting more intense, that's what we want to bridge. But once again, it's not simple.
But some leaders say they want to isolate President Putin for what is happening in Ukraine. You say we need to talk to him.
Isolating doesn't solve the problem. Rather, it just makes it worse. What's important here is how to make a dialogue or negotiation to produce agreements.
If other leaders say that he has committed war crimes, do you agree with them?
Again, this would be better resolved through discussion tables, by sitting together to find a common solution, not sanctions.
So what would be your ideal solution? What would be your best outcome of the G20?
Regarding war, again, it is crucial to provide room for dialogue. Therefore, through dialogue, it is expected that an agreement will be formed. After an agreement is formed, a ceasefire will happen. If a ceasefire has happened, the war will end and peace will follow.
You have met both leaders, right? You traveled to Moscow to meet Vladimir Putin, and also you went to Kiev. Were you trying to mediate in the conflict? Did you try to make some kind of agreement, and did it fail?
Well, I discussed a lot about peace, considering that we want stability on geopolitics and also stability on world politics and also world economy to promote better economic growth, not like what we have now. And my purpose to go there was to carry out a humanitarian and peace missions, especially in preventing food crisis. So my main concern was on food crisis at the time, because President Zelenskyy said that it has 22 million tons of grain in Ukraine, and the new harvest is around 55 million tons, meaning there is 77 million tons of grain. Meanwhile, in Russia, President Putin revealed that the country has 130 million tons of grain. In total, we have 207 million tons, a very large number. If the stock is not distributed, then there will be a food crisis. That's the problem that we want to bridge at the time.
Some people say that the solution would just simply be Russia, Vladimir Putin, withdraws from Ukraine and then the war is over. Do you see, after you met him, that there is a possibility? Do you see that there might be an opening, or is it just getting worse?
Again, the most important thing, the first point is to sit together in one table, to have negotiation, to have a dialogue, to have a communication. Therefore, we have solution. I don't want to speculate about any other matters than that.
But there's also going to be President Joe Biden. Xi Jinping is expected to come as well. Do you feel maybe there is going to be a lot of heated discussions?
It doesn't matter. If the dialogue or meeting situation gets heated, no problem. Even if the meeting gets heated, it's not a problem, so long as there is a solution, there's a dialogue. I think, why not? Competition and rivalry are common, no problem, as long as they're managed properly to avoid open conflict. And after the problem is over, global economic recovery will happen. Without that, we cannot talk about economic recovery.
Because we're not only talking about conflict in Europe right now, but tensions in your region here in Asia are also increasing, also because of the military muscles that China is showing. How worried are you that your country, that the South China Sea, that's going to be affected?
Yeah, I was not only talking about the rivalry in the war in Ukraine, but also the rivalry in the region. And once again, don't expect prosperity without stability. Therefore, we in Asia, we will continue to maintain that the Indo-Pacific region can be peaceful and to avoid the potential for open conflict. Because economic development and growth take place when there is a political and geopolitical stability, and peace will come out. From there, economic development will happen.
You have met President Xi Jinping also recently. What was your message to him to calm down the situation?
Well, first, Indonesia adheres to a free and active foreign policy. Therefore, Indonesia prioritizes cooperation and collaboration with anyone and any country based on the principle of mutual respect and the principle of mutual benefit. So, the People's Republic of China is Indonesia's strategic partner. America, the US, is also Indonesia's strategic partner. I can have a dialogue with President Joe Biden. I can also talk to President Xi Jinping. And I want to invite both of them to discuss and find a common solution for the region and also for the world.
They haven't met directly, right, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. Do you think that they're going to meet in Bali and together with the two of them?
That is why having a dialogue space is crucial. Therefore, common solution can be found.
So you think that there will be progress after the meeting? There will be some movement during the G20?
If dialogue space is available and discussion can occur again, we will find a solution. We don't want to appear to have any inclination because Indonesia again adheres to open and active foreign politics. Therefore, Indonesia can be accepted in any country. That is what we want to get to create a beneficial discussion.
But Indonesia has a voice in the UN General Assembly. And there's been also resolutions, for example, this week against Russian annexation of territories in Ukraine. Indonesia voted in favor of this resolution. So you make choices where Indonesia stands in this conflict.
Well, indeed, at one point we must decide. We must decide this carefully in order for our neutrality to stay apparent. And once again, Indonesia has always adhered to and respected international law and the UN Charter, particularly regarding the respect for territorial sovereignty and the territorial integrity of every country.
But for example, China is investing in your country $40 billion, compared to the United States only $9 billion. Is the influence of China not getting much higher, much bigger than the United States, for example? Is the United States losing its battle here?
We are open to anyone and to any country. In terms of investment, for example, we welcome every country. However, if a country reacts faster and has better communication, then you cannot blame Indonesia if we choose to go to a certain country.
So the communication is not so good from the United States?
No, we have good communication with all countries.
What should they do?
But certain countries have more intense communication for collaboration. You know, collaboration must be mutually beneficial, and Indonesia is ready to partner with anyone, with any country, and once again, based on the principle of mutual respect and mutual benefit.
But do you have a feeling that maybe the United States doesn't show enough respect, or is questioning too much, or?
Well, maybe because of the physical distance, maybe.
It's just a physical distance. You think?
Maybe.
Well, you talked about communication.
I cannot urge a country to be close to Indonesia, right?
We talked about the crisis, right, in the world right now. There is a recession also dooming in Europe. There's an energy crisis, we have a food crisis, prices are going up. Indonesia's inflation is still relatively low compared to 4.9 compared to other countries, but you had to raise the fuel price, you lowered the very costly subsidies. There is a risk that the food prices in Indonesia will go up. How worried are you? Because your population is still fragile if you look at their income, of course.
I am worried for sure, but I see that all country leaders are concerned about the same thing. And according to the World Food Program, up to 825 million people go to bed hungry. Now, this is what all country leaders must feel the empathy, how difficult their people's lives are today.
Including in Indonesia.
And the key here is to reopen food supply chain. Regarding Indonesia, in the past 3 years, Indonesia has stopped importing rice. With sufficient supply, we can control and stabilize the price. We can manage it. And every day I monitor the market. I check the price regarding rice and garlics and eggs and also chilies.
Every day you look at it?
Yeah. Every time I visit a certain region, I check the food price because it is very important now. And I have asked to the governors and mayors to use the contingency budget. And the 2% of the general allocation fund from the central government can be used to stabilize rising price for goods and services, especially food inflation. Now, this is how we fight inflation so that it is not as high as in other countries.
So you're concerned but still optimistic that Indonesia can ride this through?
I am worried, but I'm still optimistic that we can manage this. Our economic growth in the second quarter of 2022 reached 5.4%, and our inflation in August reached 4.9%. I think we should be grateful for that.
But it's important that there will be peace in the world and no wars that will drive prices up.
That is what we are worried about, that war and rivalry between countries will not get better or even worse. That's what we're afraid of, because the IMF has predicted that the global economy by 2023 will decrease to below 2.7% from what was previously estimated to experience recovery.
That would affect Indonesia as well.
And true, and that can affect Indonesia as well.
We're talking about energy transition, and Indonesia has the largest nickel reserves in the world. You're very active now trying to make car factories invest in Indonesia to have renewable cars, like electric cars. How is that going? Because you had an agreement with Elon Musk, but we haven't heard anything after that.
Well, I've had 2 phone calls with Elon Musk, and I have met him once at SpaceX, and my coordinating ministers maybe have met him more than 10 times in meetings.
What is delaying it at the moment?
You ask Elon Musk about that. For sure, Indonesia is ready to become an electric car development site for any country, for any company, and for everyone.
But does it have to do something with the investment climate in Indonesia, that some countries, maybe in Europe and the United States, are reluctant to invest in the industry?
Well, because we have the market. The consumers are there. The demand is there. So we have them.
Are you surprised that they are not all coming very quickly?
Or maybe investors consider the current world economic situation. However, with what Indonesia has done, including a structural reform for investment, we have omnibus law, a massive and evenly distributed infrastructure development in Java and other regions. And I think this is an appealing factor, and I think the opportunity to invest is now, although the global economic situation is not really that well. But again, it comes to the investors and companies who will make the investment to Indonesia.
Indonesia has been criticized for the deforestation, right? It's also been called the third largest emitter of greenhouse gas after China and the United States because of land clearing. You have taken a lot of measures to reforestation and stop also the export of palm oil a couple of months ago, which has been, I think, changed again at the moment. But my question is, do you feel that the criticism on Indonesia for its deforestation is in a way unfair because it's coming from countries who have already developed their economies and their industries, and that you feel that you have to balance this dilemma the whole time?
First of all, before, even go there, I mean, every year, forest fires always happen. And it, has burned more than 2 million hectares of land. And in 2015, we have successfully mitigated it. And the forest fire case has decreased by up to 85%. Second, we have restored the peatlands in the last 5 years. Okay, we have done that. And starting this year, we have started restoring mangroves. And by establishing a nursery center like this one, but this is especially for mangroves, and that is in Bali. And here, which is in West Java, we have also established a nursery center that produces every year 12 million tree seeds, either caliandra, eucalyptus, manglit, and teak, and various variants of trees. And other than for environment, it also supports economic growth. So between environment and economy aspects, they can grow simultaneously. This is what we are looking for.
In reality, you still have to cut down forest to develop projects or roads. I mean, in Indonesia, still every year, there's still a lot of forest being cut down. So it's not realistic, I think, to do it both at the same time.
I think we have to address both at the same time. We want to achieve a green economy, and at the same time, we also want to develop infrastructure. Both have to go in parallel. Without infrastructure, how can we run industries? Without infrastructure, how can economy can grow?
But what you see now with the energy crisis happening all over the world, that the energy transition is now being delayed.
Absolutely.
Germany is using coal again, and I heard they even come to Indonesia to buy coal. But it is a bit hypocrite, right? So talking about energy transition and then come to buy coal.
Well, as you see, we are in a difficult situation. This is not a normal situation. We do not have better options.
Last question, because of course we met each other often, and also 8 years ago, before you became the president of Indonesia. And of course we talked about the expectations and the promises you made. Now we are 8 years later, you're nearly through your second term, your last term as president. There's a lot of criticism on, that you didn't keep the promises of democratic reform, basically that the democracy was undermined. Critics have been severely fined. The army has a bigger role. The Eradication Commission has been sort of weakened. What happened to Joko Widodo, the man of the people?
Well, the global situation now is not easy, but I am pleased with the improvement of the foundations for Indonesia's competitiveness.
But this is all about the economy. Did you have to sacrifice democracy for economy?
Regarding democracy, I think, if we look at our 5 elections, everything runs well. And regarding the freedom of opinion, the freedom to express people's mind, what haven't we done? Everyone can say whatever they want now.
But opposition is harder now.
They can even mock the president. They can mock the president now.
Without ending up in prison?
They can mock the president now, and many of them ridicule the president. I see almost every day in social media, and also we don't stop, room for democracy. So what kind of freedoms that, we are debating?
You have no regrets?
Well, I think, I'm sure that the democracy in Indonesia has been on the right track, and even I think it has, passed the limit.
Kenapa? Why? Sorry.
Well, I think it's too far because Indonesia preserves the Eastern culture, which is full of manners and politeness. And so I think Indonesia's democracy is Pancasila democracy.
And it's different than the Western democracy.
It cannot be compared to democracy in the Western countries.
President Joko Widodo of Indonesia, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
You're welcome.
Сколько у нас уже народу, девчонки? 8. Мы их сразу оформляем, одеваем в готовности.
The Russian army is trying to get 300,000 new soldiers by the end of the month in what it's calling partial mobilization. Regular places have turned into draft centers. This Moscow theatre processes around 100 new recruits a day. These young men will replace some of the tens of thousands of soldiers already killed or injured in Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Я ощущаю чувство гордости за страну, за свою семью, то, что не отступил от этого долга, взял на себя такую обязанность защищать Родину.
Some people are still motivated by the lies President Vladimir Putin has told to justify this war, but others aren't happy about being forced to enlist, and the mood is sullen, a stark contrast to the heroic tone of the Soviet-era war films playing in the background. Speaking critically of the war is a criminal offence, so it's hard to know how any of these conscripts truly feel.
Что-то тоже осталось, какой-то, возможно, патриотизм, раз я все-таки не сбежал.
Какой исход видите для России, для специальной военной операции?
У меня нет такой специальности, чтобы еще что-то предвидеть, говорить и так далее. Я вот, например, вполне себе не знал, что произойдет то, что назовут сейчас спецоперацией. Неизвестно, что будет на завтрашний день. В принципе, как бы.
Vitaly was given a draft notice and less than 24 hours to report for duty.
Отец у меня живет, считай, в другом городе, Одинцове. С ними не успел попрощаться, с родными остальными тоже не успел попрощаться. Очень сейчас тяготит то, что с отцом не попрощался.
На площадку будет время положить вещи в автобус. Где-то, если родители стоят рядом, поцеловать щечку. Только на все, про все у нас будет на 3 минуты.
Moments before the bus leaves, Vitaly's father arrives.
Я так вот смотрел по телевизору, вот в регионах там и каски выдают, и бронежилеты. А здесь он даже вот свой поезд говорит. То есть получается, что как-то не продумано здесь. Это Москва.
Until today, this centre didn't even have bags for the recruits. But these men are far better equipped than some. Multiple videos circulating online seem to show fresh recruits carrying rusty rifles, being told to bring their own makeshift medical kit.
Тампоны знаете для чего?
Нет. Кровь останавливает.
And even being sent to the front lines with no training.
Нам официально сказали, что подготовки перед отправкой в зону боевых действий не будет.
The Kremlin maintains their invasion is just a special operation, but this draft process is making it increasingly clear to Russians that this is an all-out war, with all the risks that brings.
Но дело в том, что я один, у меня 3 года как жена умерла, и единственный сын остался. Поэтому у меня опасения, что... А так-то, конечно, долго надо отдать. Просто так неожиданно, что вчера вот дали, сегодня уже забирают.
Не реви, заберись тряпка.
Давай, подходи. Ну все, мужики, давай, всем хорошей дороги, удачи. Берегите себя, все, всех ждем домой. Давай, парни, спасибо вам и вашим родителям.
The draft has been a disaster across all of Russia. It's targeted poor people and included those who should be exempt. Protests have broken out and a few people have even shot recruiters. Artyom Krieger is a journalist with one of the few independent news outlets left in Russia. He was arrested while reporting on a protest and later given a draft notice, seemingly as punishment. He's also a full-time student, so he should be exempt.
So I got a draft notice several days ago. I can show it. You can see that this is a date 6 October. Here I wrote that I don't agree to get it and I don't want to go to mobilization center.
So far, Krieger hasn't been forced to follow through on enlisting, but he was still convicted of a crime, which he's fighting with the help of his lawyer, who's also his partner.
Вот тут указано, что Артем, значит, так судья оставил, что ты кричал «нет войне, нет мобилизации, Путина в окопы». Ну, естественно, там, конечно, таких лозунгов он не кричал, другие люди, да, но Артем-то нет, но должно быть прекращено это дело, прекращено в отношении него. То есть грозило то, что его отчислят из вуза.
У нас как бы такие, знаете, понятийные правила в Российской Федерации. С журналистами есть негласная такая договоренность, что, понятно, мы вас тоже можем закрыть по беспределу, если надо будет, даже уголовка, может быть, что угодно, но повестки раздавали всем. Там были мальчики, кому-то было там 18 лет, 20 лет, там были мужчины уже 30-40 лет, там были уже дедушки, которые у нас шизофрения была, ему 60 лет было, да? И поэтому, то есть это как запугивание, знаешь? То есть они запугивают не только там админарестом, штрафом возможным, а запугивают еще вот таким вот образом.
Krieger has so far decided to stay in Moscow, but the fear of being forced to enlist has led thousands of people to leave the country. Some who've opted to stay in Russia have spoken out against the draft, but doing so can come at a huge cost.
Убей меня, доброволец, твой президент будет тобою вечно доволен.
Artyom Kamardin performed an anti-draft poem at a reading in Moscow. There were not many people there, but the next day, state security forces raided his flat.
Нас повалили на пол. Меня оттащили в другую комнату. Со мной сначала был один сотрудник, который меня периодически пинал. Я слышала, как они начинают кричать про Артема, что это он. И я слышала крики ударов, после чего я просила громко, пожалуйста, не избивайте его, после чего я сама получила, чтобы он извинялся, чтобы он раздевался.
Приношу извинения, прошу прощения и каюсь перед русским многонациональным народом за сказанное мною.
Они тянули меня за волосы, таскали, то есть угрожали изнасилованием, пытались заклеить рот, после чего показывали мне фотографии голого избитого Артема, изнасилованного.
Kamardin's fiancée says he was raped with the bar from a set of weights. He's been charged with inciting hate and is currently awaiting trial.
То есть то, что происходило, это какой-то запредельный уровень жестокости. И думаем, что мы знаем, как правильно, но мы видим, что в стране происходит, и понимаем, что это все катится куда-то в пропасть, мне кажется, только туда.
Independent polls show support among Russians for the invasion is still high, even if the draft seems to have led to a slight drop. Those numbers, though, don't give the whole picture. Support seems to be more about conformity than conviction, as evidenced at the state-curated rally celebrating the illegal annexation of Ukrainian territory.
А в правде сила, а значит победа. Победа будет за нами!
State media's broadcast of the event showed an enthusiasm that didn't match the feeling at the actual rally.
Запорожская область, Херсонская область, воссоединились с Россией!
Many people were on their phones, texting, chatting, or simply documenting that they were there for their state employer before quickly heading back towards the fleet of buses that brought them. And not even Russian state media can completely hide the truth about the military failures in Ukraine.
Да, мы на Херсонщине потеряли 17 населенных пунктов.
17 населенных пунктов. Прямо тревожно, и это вежливо выражаясь.
Even as setbacks become clear, the proposed solutions from the government don't include a plan for peace. It's just more war.
Я не буду говорить, что у нас потерь нету или что они очень скромные. У нас есть потери, и они для нас чувствительны. Но они не идут ни в какое сравнение с тем, что происходит со стороны противника. Свои земли и своих людей мы, конечно, должны забрать обратно.
Alexander Borodai was once the prime minister of the self-declared Donetsk People's Republic in Russian-occupied Ukraine. Putin has filled his parliament with ultra-nationalists like Borodai, whose desire to see Ukraine taken over might be even stronger than his bosses. Is a defeat a possibility for Russia in Ukraine?
Нет. Конечно, у нас нету такой цели извести всех, грубо говоря, всех хохлов, то, что называется. Наша основная цель – это уничтожить режим Зеленского. Демилитаризация и денацификация Украины. Довольно очевидно, что эти процессы нельзя завершить до того момента, пока существует на Украине режим Зеленского. Потому что Украина никогда не была и сейчас не является государством.
I'm Michael Learmonth, editor-in-chief of Vice News. Too often, traditional news outlets shy away from the real stories and experiences of those living through global conflicts. Not Vice News. Our reporters are on the ground, fearlessly covering the human stories that shape our world. You and millions of others can continue to read, watch, and listen to Vice News for free. But we hope you'll consider making a one-time or ongoing contribution of any size at vice.com/contribute. Every contribution, no matter how big or small, helps support the journalism Vice News brings to you every day. Thank you.
Russia mobilized about 200,000 people for the war against Ukraine. Such data was provided by the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Anna Maler. Resupplying the army continues in many Russian regions, often contrary to official regulations. So, Timur Ismailov, one of the key IT specialists of Raiffeisenbank, was mobilized despite the fact that the Ministry of Digital Development of the Russian Federation granted a respite to employees in the field of information technology and communications.
When visiting the military registration and enlistment office on September 19th, he was handed a summons indicating that he would be drafted to participate in planned military training from September 26th, and he was scheduled to reappear at the military enlistment office on September 22nd.
They took away Timur's military ID and handed him a summons, but they did not send him to the training or to the medical examination. Already on October 7th, he ended up in Ukraine, and a week later, while bureaucratic procedures were going on, he died.
Information was received that Timur came under mortar fire and died on October 13th. The list from the Central Bank for Determined have not yet reached the military registration and enlistment office. The Central Bank submitted the list to the General Staff on September 28th. I'll just say it myself. More than 7 complaints have been filed. A lawsuit was filed. Appeals have been submitted to all hotlines, publications in media, etc. And such a result. Konstantin Yerokhin, Russian lawyer, on Telegram.
Russians are motivated to go to the Ukrainian front in different ways, but everywhere economically. In Tuva they got ships, in Yakutsk vegetable sets, on Sakhalin frozen fish, and in Kurgan a kilogram of smoked lard. In Buryatia the families of the mobilized were promised firewood. However, it was not enough for everyone, and in Novosibirsk conscripts are given free tickets to the local zoo.
Families, children and parents of mobilized residents of Novosibirsk can visit the zoo for free. For a free visit, a mobilized citizen must present a supporting document, a copy of a military ID, a certificate from the military registration and enlistment office. From a message on the website Novosibirsk Online.
Some Russian conscripts have already received their first payments. For example, Sergeant Putenikhin from Bashkiria, who was mobilized on September 27th, received 1,848 rubles instead of the promised 200,000.
After almost a month of being there, the mobilized got salary. Lothar through tears. Thank you, the family is supported. Wife of Sergei Putenikhin, in a comment for the website UFA Online.
Those whom the military commissars managed to catch and mobilize are equipped with the latest technology and armed to the teeth, however only in propaganda videos.
Each serviceman has first of all himself equipped, in a bulletproof vest, an unloading vest, a weapon and accordingly a helmet, and he has it all in his backpack.
In fact, conscripts simply have nothing to go to war. Wives and mothers are equipping soldiers at their own expense, but finding a military uniform is not so easy. Even with the money, its prices are skyrocketing.
Almost everyone has their own uniform bought. masks, shoes and everything else, gloves, all fully ammunition we bought ourselves.
There are among the conscripts and those who were lucky enough to receive state-owned equipment, the mobilized post online a video of its unpacking.
This thing is called a plastic paintball mask. Such is a garbage. They think that we are like these, Star Warriors. The best thing, these war shoes, made of natural rubber.
The only way for a mobilized Russian not to stay in Ukrainian soil forever and not become a war criminal is to surrender to the Ukrainian Defense Forces. You can get advice on how to be captured correctly and safely thanks to the I Want to Leave project.
Since the beginning of the project, we have already received 3,000 requests. At the moment, the project has fully justified itself. There is a result. The project is working. Russian military personnel are surrendering. Everything is going as it should.
Reported by Serhiy Kulyas, Valeria Nekipelova, UATV News. Pogukaev Andriy Ivanovich, place of birth the Luhansk region, Ukraine, Litykhine district, village Uspenka, date of birth October 29, 1983. How did you get into the army? They took me on the 1st of October. I went home from the grocery. They gave me a piece of paper and told me to read it. I read. There was nothing special. I thought I'd sign and go home. They started threatening me and said that would beat me with a machine gun.
Где это было? Когда?
How did you get captured? Where did it happen? When? I got an SMS on October 13th. I walked from the landfill. I was simply abandoned at the training ground, lost consciousness. When I woke up, everybody was gone. I want to go home, contact the military registration and enlistment office, the higher command, so that they change someone from Ukrainians to me, please.
The Russian army attacked cities of Lutsk and Kovel with Ka-101 missiles at 9 o'clock in the morning of October 22nd. They targeted at energy infrastructure facilities. All emergency services immediately arrived at the site. Police, rescuers and doctors. One person was wounded as a result of the attack.
Injuries of the first, second degree, hands and head. His condition is moderate. He lost consciousness. Now is in satisfactory condition.
In the private sector of Lutsk there were 3 explosions. Pavlo has a house and household building in 100 meters from the epicenter.
Tin plate flew from the fences like fruit falling from a tree in autumn. Windows, doors were torn out, broken and crushed.
According to the mayor, several private houses were destroyed. The owners of one of the buildings have just completed renovations. Electricity immediately disappeared in Lutsk and water supply stopped. Utility workers attempting to restore services.
Arrival, according to preliminary information, was made by 3 Ka-101 missiles. The energy facility is completely destroyed, so there is no possibility of restoring it. About the restoration of electricity and water, as soon as there is information, we will report. All boiler houses are stopped. Trolleybuses also do not work because of the absence of electricity. Igor Polishuk, mayor of Lutsk.
State emergency service crew is working on the site of the explosion.
Rescuers worked with air foam and water cannons to fight these difficult fires. Volodymyr Nesterov, spokesperson of the State Emergency Service of Ukraine in the Volyn region.
Authorities in Lutsk managed to partially restore the water supply. Within a day, the water supply will be resumed to the city of Kovel as well. But the local authorities do not know when it will be possible to restore electricity. Reported by Roman Smoler, Anastasia Lisova, UATV News.
So hello everybody, today we have a very interesting guest and I hope our conversation will be very interesting because let me introduce my guest. It's William Browder, is a financier and political activist. He's a CEO and co-founder of Hermitage Capital Management, the investment advisor to the Hermitage Fund. And more of this, he is a publisher and he's a writer, and his new book is called Freezing Order. It's all about the true story of money laundering by Russian Federation and the true story of what's going on in the Kremlin, Putin's environment. So hello.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. And my first question will be maybe hard for you, but anyways, from what I saw from a lot of articles in the internet and the free published, you are called in the press as Putin's #1 enemy. And as we know, Putin doesn't love his enemies, and more of this, he doesn't tolerate them. So in the first chapter of your book, you describe the experience of your short-term detention in Madrid in 2018 in violation of all norms of international and domestic law, but you were released. And my question is, what is your strength and what is your power, and how many more persons like you who are still being enemy of Vladimir Putin, #1, can speak openly, freely today and still be sitting in front of me?
Well, so first of all, I should say that when the book was published and when we conceived the book, I probably was Putin's #1 enemy. He really had me like in his head. But I think that we can all safely say that Vladimir Zelenskyy is Putin's #1 enemy now, and perhaps Alexei Navalny is his #2 enemy. But I think I still have the #3 slot in his head, and it's been a long, hard struggle. He's hated me ever since I passed the Magnitsky Act, which freezes the assets and bans the visas of his cronies and human rights violators in Russia, and this happened in 2012. And so Putin has been chasing me all around the world. The incident you just described in Madrid was based on a Russian Interpol arrest warrant, and there have been 8 of them since the Magnitsky Act was passed. I live in London, and they've also made numerous, probably a dozen or so requests to the British government for mutual legal assistance and extradition. I've been warned by the Department of Justice that there is a kidnapping plot to try to illegally render me and take me back to Moscow. And of course, there is the incident in the summit between Trump and Putin when Putin asked Trump to hand me over. And so it's been a long fight, and it's not easy. And part of the reason why Putin has been going after me so aggressively is that it's not just to punish me, but he needs to make an example out of me, because if I can stand up to him and I can cause him all these problems and I can create sanctions and all these types of things, if other people started to emulate me, then his power completely crumbles. And so he's one of these people who he lives by the jail yard credo, which is that if nobody can disrespect him, because the moment that somebody disrespects a jail yard person, then everybody thinks they're weak and then they pile on to them. And so it's been a constant struggle. I'm lucky to be alive. It's been 13 years since this whole fight has began. And it's primarily, I think my survival has been, well, I guess 2 things. One is that I've been very vigilant and I've been taking all sorts of precautions to make it difficult for them. And 2, they're not very good at this. They're awful, mean, murderous people in Putin's regime, but they're also very incompetent. And of course, you have seen that on a much broader theater of military intervention, how bad they are, but they're bad at everything they do. And that's part of the reason why I'm still here today.
We will talk about the development of the history that you're talking about, the Magnitsky Act. But first, let me ask some lyrics about Putin himself. So, talking about enemies, do you think Putin realizing himself as the enemy #1 for himself, and what he's doing right now, he's committing a suicide of his own enemy, I mean himself. And do you think it will be just about him, or it will affect all the environment of Putin as well?
Well, so what we need to understand about Putin is that he's not like you or me or anyone watching this show, he's a verified psychopath. What is a psychopath? If you look it up in the physician's desk reference book, a psychopath is somebody who doesn't have any empathy, so his heart won't beat faster if someone's being tortured to death in front of him. A psychopath is a person who doesn't have any conscience, and a psychopath is a person only concerned for their own well-being and their own survival. So that is Vladimir Putin. And why is he, in my opinion, the reason that he's at war right now with Ukraine is not because of NATO, a fear of NATO enlargement, or because he's trying to build a bigger Russian empire for his legacy. I think he's at war in Ukraine because he's a dictator who has stolen so much money over the last 22 years from his own people that he's afraid that at some moment the whole thing will explode. Like we're watching on TV, for example, in Iran right this minute. They killed, one person in a police station, and the whole country is now on the verge of revolution. And that's what Putin is afraid of in Russia. And so I believe he started this war in Ukraine very simply to distract his people away from him towards essentially a fictitious enemy. The Ukrainian people, I think you're correct in your assessment that he is, signing his own death warrant. Now, the one thing I should point out is that, and I speak from a position of experience in a conflict with this man, is that one never should underestimate Putin, no matter what kind of successes you have in this battle. Putin, he has unbelievable capacity to inflict pain on his own people in order to inflict pain on his enemy. And so if this requires sending another 500,000 men into battle to die just to keep the war going so he doesn't lose, he would do that, and it wouldn't affect him at all. And so he is on the ropes right now.
Actually, I wanted to talk about this at the end of our interview, but you started this. That's why I remember you once said in some interview that for Putin or for dictators like him, there's no end game in this process. So how do you think, who may end or change the rules of games that Putin is playing? Anyways, I don't even understand what game he's playing. But if he doesn't stop this game, who will stop it?
Well, I think the Ukrainians will stop this game. So if you successfully, if the troops in Ukraine successfully push the Russian troops back to the February 24th borders, or maybe even further, back to 2014 borders, the Russian people will have no more patience for this. The Russian people like a strong man, but they absolutely don't like a strong man who loses. They can't stand a loser. The Russian people will take care of Putin very quickly if he fails in Ukraine. And so Ukraine is really doing a service far greater than protecting yourself. You're doing a service, you're losing men and economics and everything that goes along with it for the whole world, because Putin wouldn't stop in Ukraine. He would be the next stop at the Estonian border, pointing his guns at Estonia to see how serious America and Europe is about being part of NATO. So it's at this point, the only hope the world has is for Ukraine to succeed.
What else I've read from your speeches, from your interview, you once said that 95% of what's going on is upon the Kremlin and upon the Russia Federation, and 5% is upon world politicians, elites, or whatever. But on the other ways, you say it's useless to hit Putin himself by the sanctions and so on. And as we see from now, it's maybe even useless to hit the oligarchs, because much more money comes from the European Union for the export of energy resources. And it's withdrawal from the budget, this money, and get it to the war, to continue the war. Like, say, what can push Putin out of his stage if it's not oligarchs and if it's not his own nation and his own society?
So the West has been doing more now than they've ever done before. The sanctions are to starve Putin of the money that he needs in order to fight the war and kill Ukrainians. Basically, we need to cut off the money that he's getting. And sanctions have helped. I mean, so we've frozen what I would call the savings of Russia. This is these $350 billion of central bank reserves and the assets of oligarchs all over the world. And those oligarchs, by the way, hold Putin's money. But you're absolutely correct that every day Russia receives $1 billion in revenue from the sale of oil and gas. And every day they spend $1 billion killing Ukrainians. And so what are we going to do about that? And interestingly, coming back to your first question, Putin is doing something that we in the West don't seem to have the stomach to do, which is he's shut off the pipeline. Mm-hmm. He shut off the pipeline. And so Gazprom exports to Europe make up 25% of the Russian government budget. And he's now effectively sanctioned himself, something that we never had the stomach to do. So that's pretty impressive and helpful to us, even if he did it. I think that going forward.
Anyways, as you just said, elites, world elites, and their decision changes as time goes by. So, going back in time to 2012, you wrote that back in that times that Putin was already financially planning this war with Ukraine. And therefore, this Magnitsky Act and the freezing of certain funds of the oligarchs really interfered with him and with his decisions. But why? But why was intelligence data and evidences like yours not enough to prevent the development events? More of this. You always remind in your interviews about Chechnya, about Georgian war, about annexion of Crimea, about Donbass, about catastrophe of MH17, deaths and trying to killings in Salisbury, and more, many more in Syria, actually. So we can go on a lot. How much time has to pass then the politicians of top leading countries will finally understand with whom they are dealing?
I think that the politicians today understand who they're dealing with. I mean, it was a wake-up call on February 24th for all sorts of politicians who completely and utterly failed over the last 15 or 20 years. I mean, a complete and absolute policy failure. And as you rightly say, and I was screaming from the rooftops for years, that we need to get tough with Putin, that if we started to react to the invasion of Georgia, the invasion of Crimea, the shooting down of MH17 and so on, if we had given Putin a real taste of what our medicine was like, he might have had a second opinion, a different opinion, a revised view on what to do based on his view. He wouldn't have gone into Ukraine perhaps. And, Putin, everybody makes calculations based on risk and reward. For Putin, the reward was elevated approval ratings and safety, and he ended up being wrong. And the trouble is that now he can't back out. And so the only option is to totally destroy him. The trouble with that option, and it's the only option, is that there will be many casualties on both sides in that process. Nobody had any illusions about it. Everyone just thought they could just, push the problem down the road and keep on getting the money.
Talking about your activity right now, it's absolutely obvious, and your goal is absolutely open and clear from what you say openly from television and in other mass media. It is in the freezing order book and in your speeches openly, whether it is being achieved today, because the executioners, the people who killed actually Sergei Magnitsky, are still not punished, although they are revealed Actually, we know their names. There is a war in Ukraine, as we talk about right now. And the Kremlin's policy is not changing in any ways. So maybe you will have more vision of the effectiveness of the activity of this Magnitsky Act, not only in Russia, but in other countries that take part in this, that signed this act.
Well, so the Magnitsky Act is hugely powerful because money is the root of all problems, and the Magnitsky Act freezes money, and it freezes the money particularly of dictators and kleptocrats like Putin and his cronies who do terrible things in Russia and then try to keep their money safely in the West. When the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012, Putin made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. And as you mentioned before, I think he knew as early as 2012 that he was going to do something dramatic and dangerous and horrible, probably to Ukraine. What I'd like to see, and I think this would be a hugely important step, is that after the $1 trillion of damage that Russia has done to Ukraine, there's going to be money needed to fix everything. And where's the money going to come from? I think the Russians should pay. Mm-hmm. And nicely now we have money in our possession that we can use for them to pay for it. And so one of my big goals right now is to convince lawmakers around the world that this money should be repurposed from not just frozen.
Talking about how the politicians and how the attitude of countries changed, it's interesting because from what I see from not far away news, one of the latest high-profile cases that you actively cover in the media is Swiss or Switzerland. I will quote you. This is a quote from International Division of Swiss Public Non-State Television and Radio Company. So you're saying the authorities must behave differently if they want to show, of course, Switzerland is not Russia's pocket. Corrupt Russian officials have parked in Switzerland, a secretive and wealthy Alpine state, millions and millions of money stolen from their homeland. So you are trying to pay much attention to the Magnitsky Act investigation, and what action in all of this Switzerland take part of, and why it's so influential in this situation?
Well, Switzerland is one of the countries that has the largest amount of Russian money stashed in Swiss banks. Based on what they publicly disclose, the Swiss Bankers Association publicly has said that the amount of Russian money in Switzerland is between $200 billion and $250 billion. This is what they admit to. And so if that's what they're saying publicly, I think the number is probably 500 billion or maybe more. And we also know that when this war started, the Swiss raised their hand and said, we're going to cooperate with the allied countries, and if they're going to freeze oligarch assets, so are we. And so all of a sudden they made this big announcement as if they're somehow legitimate partners. And then they froze 7 billion of the 200 or 250 billion that they admit to. Mm-hmm. And then a few days later, they said, well, actually, 4 billion of the 7 we can't really freeze. And so they've frozen 3 billion of 200 or 250, whatever you believe, which is a de minimis amount of money. And why are they not freezing the rest? Why are they not being aggressively going after all this money? And the answer is that the Swiss have a history of this. The Swiss, remember when Jews put money in the Swiss bank before and during the Holocaust to try to protect their wealth, and then they died and their relatives showed up, and the Swiss said, sorry, I don't know who you're talking about, and kept the money for themselves. And that was a huge scandal. It took many decades to resolve, and it was only after public humiliation and embarrassment that it was resolved. My own experience with Switzerland is even worse. That we found money connected to the Magnitsky case going to Switzerland. We filed a criminal complaint with the Swiss law enforcement authorities 10 years ago, more actually. They froze the money. And then it turned out that one of the key people involved in investigating the case was bribed by the Russians. Mm-hmm. And I don't just say that. the Swiss discovered it. The Swiss authorities discovered it. He was fired. He was prosecuted. He was convicted. And even after all of that, the Swiss have decided in principle, they haven't done it yet, to return most of the money that was frozen back to the criminals in Russia. And so this is a bad country.
You said it's the case of past, but today I found the investigation of anti-corruption watchdog. It's Mark Pitt. He wrote a book, Gold Laundering and the Dirty Secrets of the Gold Trade and How to Clean Up. So he's talking about the beneficence that Switzerland got during its neutrality in World War II by purchasing vast amounts of gold from allied and Axis powers. So they earn almost 79% of German gold delivered to foreign countries and made a lot of money in this. So it's not the question of past, it's question of nowadays. And more of this, I see from your investigations another names of banks and countries. For example, Denmark, you remind Danske Bank and Sampo Bank, where there were found billions, I mean, $234 billion that was stolen, as I understand, from Russian population, from Russian nation money and delivered to these banks. So maybe it's the question not of the past, of the nowadays. Until nobody punished, there's no future.
No, I think that you know, the West has been very sort of noble in announcing sanctions, but there have been no serious reforms in the system that allowed the Russian gangsters, Russian politicians, Russian organized crime to launder hundreds of billions of dollars to the West. And so, as you mentioned, we found $234 billion of money that was laundered through Danske Bank in Estonia. And that's been documented, that's been researched, that's been proven. We don't have the research and the documentation on Raiffeisen Bank in Vienna, where we know an enormous amount of money was laundered, nor do we have that same evidence for what's happened behind the doors of UBS and Credit Suisse in Switzerland or Deutsche Bank in Germany. I believe that the total amount of money that's been stolen from the Russian people and then laundered into the West, where it now sits, is $1 trillion. And there have been absolutely almost zero prosecutions, seizures, etc., of that money. In fact, I can tell you that where I live in London, the British law enforcement authorities have not conducted one single investigation into Russian money laundering and Russian organized crime here since Putin came to power. And this is probably the largest recipient of dirty money from Russia.
Let's specify if it started from exclusively Russia and Russian corruption system, but now it acts not only for Russia, but for any country that are corrupted and taking and laundering money in other countries, right? So, I mean, it's globally.
It's a global Magnitsky Act. Mm-hmm. You know, there's horrible things going on in Myanmar. And the Magnitsky Act has sanctioned a bunch of generals in Myanmar. And so it goes after bad guys everywhere. It's a great way to create a disincentive, a powerful disincentive for people to commit crimes and act on the orders of dictators.
You know what's upsetting me as well? That I wrote from your previous far away interviews, one of the surnames that now is very popular as a one of the oppositional leaders in Russia, and talking about all the environment of Putin and how it may change if he will be eliminated from the power. It's Khodorkovsky. I found out from your stories that you was one who investigated with your company the corruption schemes of Khodorkovsky, and all the story, how he was in jail and how he stayed in jail, and after this man is now one of the oppositioners. So do you see any clean people? You know Russia, you've been living there for about 10 years, if I'm not mistaken, so you know Russians very good. Is there anybody to talk to after the elimination of Putin?
First of all, let me say that Khodorkovsky was one of the 22 oligarchs who ruled Russia before Putin came to power, and he was one of my biggest enemies in that period of time. And when they arrested him, I thought, great, one down, 21 to go. But then Putin didn't arrest any more oligarchs. He put Khodorkovsky in jail so he could become the biggest oligarch himself. And Khodorkovsky was effectively politically prosecuted. He spent 10 years in jail. He came out of jail, and in my opinion, he paid any debt he had to society and more since he was politically persecuted. And we're now friends and allies in this fight, and we have been for a number of years since he was released in 2014. And so he's one of the strongest opposition people to Putin. But I would say that there are several others that would be helpful. The biggest and the most well-known is Alexei Navalny. Alexei Navalny, if he were the choice of the Russian people after Putin and his regime falls, Alexei Navalny would end the war and he would rebuild relations with the West. And I'm sure of that. And so that is, we also have my good dear friend, Vladimir Kara-Murza. Vladimir Kara-Murza is a big character in my book. They tried to poison him twice in Russia, tried to kill him with poison because he was so active helping to pass the Magnitsky Act all over the world. He went back, he went back to Russia, protested the war from Russia, was on CNN calling Putin a murderer. An hour later, he was arrested. They first charged him with the crime of calling the war a war, 9 years. Then they charged him with being a member of an undesirable organization, another 5 years. He's up to 14. And as you just mentioned, 2 days ago, they charged him with treason, another 22 years. I can guarantee you that if Putin was eliminated, and the Russians eliminate not just Putin, but the whole structure of his regime, because it's not Putin, it's all these people around him, and they're looking for a new leader. I could imagine Alexei Navalny being the president and Vladimir Kara-Murza being the prime minister, and them making amends, stopping the war, of course, making amends with Ukraine, and cleaning up the relationship between Russia and the Western world. I think that there are totally reasonable people to do that, and so it's not a hopeless situation. Now, of course, if Putin is replaced, or let's say he dies in his sleep, and the system maintains itself, then you'll have some other horrible warlike monster replace him, like Patrushev, the head of the Security Council, or Shoigu, the defense minister, or one of these characters, and it'll be no different. So it's not a certainty by any means that the Putin regime falls, or if Putin falls, that the war is over. It all depends on how it falls and who comes in place next.
Can we say in this situation that the proverb works like the enemy of my enemy is my friend in this situation with Russia, unfortunately?
Well, I mean, it can get very complicated. I mean, there are certain people that are reasonable people. We know them, the ones who are the opposition. Now, Alexei Navalny has said some things which are very distasteful to Ukrainians. I think he supported the annexation of Crimea, which is a total non-starter. But he also has said very clearly and without any reservations that this war completely is illegal, irresponsible, murderous, and must stop. And I think that that's a pretty reasonable. I think you should grab onto that and be happy about that.
Mr. Broder, can I ask you a personal question? I mean, it's interesting for me. You are a businessman and financier and investor, and the very essence of the area, implies it's a profit. I mean, the goal of your activity, like a businessman, it's getting profit. So there are legal and, let's say, alternative ways to increase one's profits, and the history sometimes give a chance to people who are talented and who can use the time and place where he is to make this profit. I mean, that what happened in 90s. And post-Soviet 90s in Moscow, it's like, it's just the time where you started your career in Russian Federation, an investor. Your investments of your company was the biggest, the largest at that times, right? And my question is, I've read from your interview in Snob magazine in 2011, where you write, in the period from 1999 to 2003, we succeeded a lot because our interests obviously coincided with the Putin regime, and I had the very best job in the world. That's what you said. What made you change your mind, even though you knew from the beginning all the all the controversial things that's going on in the economy of Soviet bloc that almost was dead. So, I mean, using this situation, you already knew what will bring profit to you, but you changed your mind. Why?
So when I went to Russia, I started investing in these very cheap shares, and then I discovered that all of the companies I was investing in were being robbed by the oligarchs. And so I owned a share of the companies, but I didn't have a share of anything because they were stealing all the money. And so I did something to make money which has never been done before, which is instead of accepting the corruption, I decided to challenge the corruption. And the way I challenged the corruption was researching how these guys went about the stealing and then exposing it. And so I did this, and it might not have had any impact, except that the time that I started exposing the stealing in these big Russian companies was the same time that Vladimir Putin came to power. And Putin, when he came to power, wasn't the all-confident, all-powerful tyrant that he is today. He was very meek, and he was meek because all the oligarchs had stolen the power from him. So the oligarchs were stealing money from me, and they were stealing power from Putin. And I've never met Vladimir Putin. I didn't meet him then. I've never met him since then. But we had an alignment of interests because he was fighting with the oligarchs at the same time I was fighting with the oligarchs. And to use a word that you mentioned previously, this was one of these expressions, your enemy's enemy is your friend. And so as I would expose the oligarchs, he would step in and he would crush them the best he could. And as a result, my investments started going up in value. And as you quoted me, it was the best job in the world. I could make Russia a better place and make money at the same time. And I wished it went on forever. But unfortunately, Putin wasn't sincere in getting rid of the oligarchs. He just wanted to become the biggest oligarch himself. And to use the name of Khodorkovsky you mentioned before, he arrested Khodorkovsky, who was the biggest oligarch, put him on trial, allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia on trial, sitting in a cage. And the rest of the oligarchs went to Putin and said, what do we have to do so we don't sit in a cage? And Putin said, real simple, 50%. And that was the moment Putin became the richest man in the world. And that was the moment that our interests diverged because I was still trying to fight the corruption. But instead of fighting the corruption, I was now fighting Putin. And after that, I was expelled from the country. I was declared a threat to national security. My offices were raided. My lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, started to investigate. He discovered the raid of the offices led to a $230 million government corruption scheme. He exposed it. And in retaliation, he was arrested, tortured for 358 days in Russian police detention, and murdered on November 16, 2009. And so my experience with Putin has been one where when he showed his true face, it turned out to be the most criminal and corrupt face you can imagine. And people talk about Putin as some type of statesman who's trying to, maybe we don't like it, but he's trying to rebuild the Russian Empire. That's not at all the case. Putin is just a crook, a common financial criminal. And his actions are consistent with that all the way from the very beginning, and I can prove it. And his motivations are of a criminal just trying to keep his money and trying to survive. Well, the reason he's as powerful as he is not because he's all that powerful, is because we give him the power. We act scared. We try to appease him. And so I think that the key to succeed is for the West not to give Putin this power, not to give him an off-ramp, not to give him face-saving the way that Emmanuel Macron is trying to do. It's just to beat back to his place and let the Russians take care of him when he gets there.
At the end of your book, you are writing your thoughts about why do Ukrainians need the important story of Magnitsky and why we should all read, I mean, who have a wish, we can read this book. It's open in internet, in the Ukrainian language, actually. We can find it. We will leave the link to your book to read. So why it's so important and how it can change the situation in Ukraine for now?
Well, I think that probably the most powerful part of my story for Ukrainians, putting aside all the financial, the thriller part where you might think about how the Russians launder their money, but the most powerful part of my story for Ukrainians is my story is about how one man without a lot of power has been able to stand up to Vladimir Putin and so far survive and succeed in causing him real trouble. And I think that Ukrainians should understand that that you can stand up to Putin, and you can stand up to Russia, and you have been standing up, and it's been working. And it's I think it will give you some inspiration to carry on with your own fight, because your own fight is destined to succeed because you care. You have a moral high ground and a moral mission to defend yourself and to fight off these terrible murderous invaders.
Thank you very much for your work. Thanks for your honest dialogue, your honest answers, and I wish you strong and health. And I wish that you will find a lot of people like you, because as much people like you, the faster we will change something in this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I just remind our audience that we had a talk with William Broder, a financier, politician, activist, and the writer, the publisher of the book that is called Freeze and Order, that you can find on the internet. The link we will leave you. So stay with us, and will be more.
Die Welt von oben. Auch bei bewaffneten Konflikten geht heute kaum mehr etwas ohne Internet und Satellitenkommunikation. Die ukrainischen Streitkräfte nutzen derzeit das US-amerikanische Satellitennetz Starlink. Und die Ukraine ist auch sehr darauf angewiesen. Was können die neuen Satellitensysteme, was bisherige Kommunikationsanlagen nicht konnten? Und warum ist ganz besonders die Ukraine auf ein schnelles Netz angewiesen? Florian Petauschnik hat sich das angesehen.
Mit solchen Raketenstarts ist alles losgegangen. Internetsatelliten werden in die Erdumlaufbahn gebracht. Starlink, das sollte Internet für alle werden, wie der mehrfache Firmengründer Elon Musk angekündigt hat. Internetzugang auch dort, wo sonst nichts ist. Weit und breit kein Handynetz und keine Standleitung. Heute ist das System zu einer wichtigen Technologie im Krieg geworden.
Krieg führen ohne Starlink wäre so, als würde man einen Soldaten ohne Waffe in den Kampf schicken. Diese Aussage stammt von einem ukrainischen Kommandanten. Und in der Tat, Starlink verschafft der Ukraine einen enormen Vorteil auf dem Gefechtsfeld. Der Feind kann die Kommunikation nur schwer abhören und Daten werden von Drohnen direkt auf Smartphones oder Tablets übertragen.
Auch Cornelius Granik betont, wie sehr die Ukraine auf die Satelliten angewiesen ist. Er ist Präsident der Ukraine-Hilfe in Österreich und war Chef bei einem Technologiekonzern in der Ukraine.
Was die Telekommunikation betrifft, ist die Ukraine bis zum Jahr 2014 ein 2- bis 3G-Land gewesen. Das heißt, mobiles Internet war fast nicht verfügbar. Die Mobilfunkanbieter haben sich gerade auf den Weg gemacht, Investitionen in diese Infrastruktur vorzunehmen. Und das Ganze ist eigentlich nicht in der Fläche gut ausgebaut worden.
Die Internetsatelliten helfen jetzt aus. Sie umkreisen die Erde in ein paar hundert Kilometern Höhe und sind damit näher als Internetsatelliten, die es davor schon gegeben hat. Heißt, der Übertragungsweg ist jetzt kürzer als bisher und die Kommunikation ist schneller.
Das sind ähnliche Verzögerungszeiten, wie Sie in den Handynetzen finden. Und man nähert sich immer weiter auch dem Bereich, in dem man tatsächlich schon bei einer fest verkabelten Internetverbindung hat. Besonders bei der Kommunikation ist geringe Verzögerung wichtig. Man stelle sich vor, im Krisenfall, alles ist nervös, alles muss schnell gehen. Wenn man da jetzt lange Verzögerungen hat, fällt man sich ins Wort und die Kommunikation wird sehr, sehr mühsam.
Ein weiterer Vorteil einer solchen Technologie ist, dass man am Boden nicht unbedingt eine Steckdose für den Betrieb braucht.
Für den Betrieb von so einer Bodenstation kommt natürlich auf das System drauf an, aber von dem, was in der Ukraine im Moment eingesetzt wird, sind wir bei ca. 65 Watt. Das ist ein typisches Handynetzteil, was diese Energie liefert. Das kann man mit entsprechenden Batterie plus vielleicht einer Solarzelle sehr gut verwenden.
Dabei ist Starlink nicht das einzige Projekt, das schnelles Satelliteninternet auf diese Weise bereitstellen soll. Auch OneWeb ist eine Firma, die das möglich machen will. Und auch aus China kamen letztes Jahr derartige Projektideen für Satelliteninternet. In der Ukraine bleibt man derzeit bei der aktuellen Lösung.
Starlink allein ist nicht kriegsentscheidend, doch seine Bedeutung für die Ukraine kann nicht hoch genug bewertet werden.
Friede wäre halt am schönsten. Und Weltraumforschung, die geht auch friedlich.
Бажаю здоров'я, шановні українці.
Good health to you, fellow Ukrainians. I held another meeting of the staff of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief on October 21st. The main points of the agenda are quite obvious. The protection of our skies from enemy missiles and drones, the protection of infrastructure facilities, the destruction of the positions of the occupiers, the advancement of our forces, and everything necessary to support the army. Military intelligence ministers delivered reports. Every day we are bringing the results Ukraine needs, both on the ground and in the air. We are also working on the necessary results at sea. The situation around the export grain initiative is becoming more and more tense these weeks. The enemy is doing everything to slow down our food exports. I believe that with these actions, Russia is deliberately inciting the food crisis, so that it becomes as acute as it was in the first half of this year. As of October 21st, more than 100 ships are in the queues to fulfill contractual obligations for the supply of our agricultural products. This is an artificial queue. It arose only because Russia is deliberately delaying the passage of ships. Every day that ships with food spent in the queue means an increase in social and political tension in the countries that consume our agricultural products. Here are just some of the states to which food exports are delayed due to Russia: Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Lebanon, Iraq, China, Bangladesh, Indonesia. Our partners, the United Nations, Turkey and others, are fully informed about this situation. During the operation of our grain initiative, due to the Russian slowdown, we under-exported about 3 million tons of food. This is the annual volume of consumption for 10 million people. Russia is doing everything to ensure that at least hundreds of thousands of these people become forced migrants who will seek asylum in the same Turkey or European Union countries, or die of hunger. And we, together with our partners, must do everything so that the grain initiative is not only preserved, but also works at 100% capacity. The right to food and to life without hunger are fundamental rights for absolutely every person on earth. And that is why Russian attempts to exacerbate the food crisis are also aggression against every person on earth. On October 21st, I held a meeting with representatives of the United States Congress who arrived in Kiev. I thank them for their continued bipartisan support and for the tremendously powerful things America is doing to help us protect freedom. We discussed the key issue for today: anti-aircraft and anti-missile defense. We also talked about financial support, about our political interaction, about what new anti-European and anti-democratic steps to expect from Russia and its accomplices in terror. We touched upon the topic of Iranian supplies for Russian terror. This terror against our infrastructure, against our energy, was discussed by the United Nations Security Council on October 21st. The meeting was convened at the request of our state. I met with the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I thanked her for the help and informed about our new needs that have arisen due to the Russian terror. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is already providing financial support to Ukrenergo and has all the data on what steps we need to take to restore energy and social facilities, to build housing for Ukrainians. We agreed upon positions on the eve of the conference on the reconstruction of our state, which is to be held in Germany on October 25th. During the day of October 21st, an air alert was sounded in most regions of Ukraine. There are new downings of drones and enemy aircraft. Active hostilities continue in the east and south of Ukraine. Our armed forces retain the initiative. I want to commend the fighters of the 25th Separate Airborne Brigade for their skillful and thoughtful actions in destroying the enemy in the eastern direction. I am also thankful to the warriors of the 60th Separate Infantry Brigade, whose units are showing good results in the Kherson region. Only since the beginning of October, the fighters of this brigade trophied more than 30 units of Russian armored vehicles, 1,000 projectiles for tanks and 3 jet-sealed cannons. All these weapons will definitely help liberate our land. I am also grateful to the fighters of the 59th Separate Motorized Infantry Brigade, named after Yakov Hanzuk. This week the boys showed excellent results in destroying enemy equipment and ammunition. I also thank the warriors of the 35th Separate Marine Brigade, named after Rear Admiral Mikhailo Ostrogradsky, for their steadfastness in the defense of the regained frontiers. And one more thing, on October 21st, the government made an important decision that affects tens of thousands of Ukrainian students, those whose home is in the temporarily occupied territory or in the areas near the front, as well as children of fallen defenders of Ukraine, family members of combatants. All of them will be transferred from the contractual form of education to the budgetary one in our universities and colleges. Details of this decision should be made public by the Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine. I thank everyone who fights and works for our country. Thank you to everyone who brings Ukraine's victory closer. Glory to our best people. Glory to Ukraine.
The Russian economy is just fine. At least that's the gist of what President Vladimir Putin said last week in a speech at an event in St. Petersburg. But are sanctions actually starting to bite, or have they only served to blow back on Europe and America? Well, this is DW Business Q&A, where we'll ask the experts your questions. 4 months into the war with Ukraine, there are indeed some head-scratchers. The ruble is in a better position against the US dollar than at the start of the war. Russian revenues from energy exports like gas and oil are up, and they even took over McDonald's across the country. But is it really so simple? I'm Daniel Winter, and thank you very much for joining me. And also joining me, I've got 2 experts to help me peek behind the curtain. Emily Sherwin is our former Moscow correspondent, and you've spoken to people from the Russian government and reported there for a long time. And yeah, the Russian government essentially forced you out, and the other reporters from DW's Moscow bureau and forced you to leave. But you're here. That's the most important thing. She joins me here in the studio. And Maria Shagina researches sanctions at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and she joins us from Zurich. Thank you very much, Maria, for joining us as well. And if you're watching this live, now is your turn to ask any burning questions you have on Russia and its economy. Just post them in the live chat and we'll ask our guests. So let's get started. We'll be taking a few user questions live in just a few minutes. But first, I want to start with a look at what's happening right now in Russia with the currency, the ruble. After an initial slump in March, it hit a 7-year high against the US dollar this week and is up 35% this year. Let's see it from the perspective of the US dollar. On February 24th, $1 could buy about 80 rubles. Sanctions quickly affected the Russian currency. On March the 14th, $1 could buy just under 117 rubles. At the end of March, its value recovered. Since then, the dollar buying kept falling until the all-time record of 56.3 rubles to $1 US dollar recorded on June the 21st. So, yeah, it's a very difficult situation for the ruble, but now it's bounced back. It's really difficult to decipher what's going on here. But you know, you've been out of Moscow for a few months now, but you're still in contact with people on the ground. You still monitor the situation there. So people in Russia have seen prices whipsaw all over the place for their daily goods, everything that they're buying on a day-to-day basis. What's the general feeling among Russians right now?
I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, as usual. You know, you have on the one hand people who are worried still, I think, but also there's a lot of defiance. You know, initially you mentioned the shock of this on the economy, and that also affected prices. Prices went up. There was some panic buying. There was a lot of, you know, shock and worry among the Russian population. We saw pictures of, you know, people standing in line outside of ATMs trying to get out dollars and euros, trying to also buy products at Western chains that were leaving the country. That was also, you know, there were lines outside of stores as well. Now I think things are kind of stabilizing a little bit, and surveys also show that. So there are surveys from May from the independent pollster Levada Center, which show that people are less concerned now about Western sanctions than they were back in February. So back in February, 46% said that they were very worried or a little bit worried. Now it's gone down to 38%. So people are still pretty worried, but getting a little bit less worried, I would say. And actually, 3/4 of people say that Russia should continue its political course no matter what happens and regardless of Western sanctions. So you can see that kind of defiance that I think is very strong. It has been very strong in the Russian narrative for quite a long time now. People say we're surrounded by enemies, but it doesn't matter. We'll defeat them. We'll show them that we're strong anyway. And I think that very much applies to the sanctions now as well.
It's really interesting because a lot of the time in business news we deal with numbers and we deal with supranational organizations and all of this other kind of stuff. It's very far away from the people. But here we have seen the narrative that's going on when you look at the charts reflected in how people are feeling on the ground. It really is something tangible. But Maria, I'd like to turn to you now and just ask, what has gone on with the ruble? It has staged a rapid recovery, and not even just a recovery, but strengthened further than it was at the start of the war. How has this happened?
The miraculous rebound of the ruble is obviously the story that the Russian government very much would like to underline, that everything is stabilized. The Fortress Russia strategy that was put in place in 2014 is back up and running. It has been rebuilt with the unprecedented windfall from energy, hydrocarbons, that, as was said, everything is fine, everything is normal. But the ruble, the exchange on the ruble is artificially maintained. So without the micromanagement from the central bank and rather skillful intervention from the Russian officials, the exchange rate might not be the same tomorrow or in a couple of weeks. So this is the story of stabilization that Russia wants to portray, but this is only half or less half of the sanctions story and where the sanctions are working. The other piece of this puzzle is imports. And we've seen unprecedented drastic fall of imports, not just from sanctioned countries, but also non-sanctioned countries like China. The imports from China fell by 40%, from South Korea, Taiwan, who are responsible for export of semiconductors, chips, fell by 70%. So while Russia is accruing this hard currency from the export of hydrocarbons, it has nowhere to spend it. And this is the situation it has locked itself in. And as you said, the ruble has strengthened so much that it's now detrimental to Russian exporters, which usually favor a much weaker currency when they export the energy commodities to Europe. So this is only half of the story. How to evaluate it, definitely something that the Russian government wants to underline it. But the strengthening of the ruble also serves towards the purpose to curb inflation. The Russian government doesn't want ordinary Russians to feel any pain, to feel any change. They don't even say that this is the war happening. The same with the currency and inflation. They don't want ordinary Russians to see that something is different. But apart from the polls that were cited here, that 50% of Russians maybe don't care about sanctions, there are another indications that more than 70% of Russians don't plan any big purchases. So the fact that something is changing is gradually sinking in.
Okay, so it's starting to sink in, and Putin is selling this rise in the ruble as a success. But as you say, there's more to it than that. And we have a question here from Lisa, and she says, how long can the artificial life supports, which you just mentioned, on the ruble be maintained? What do you think?
The central bank government, as I said, has introduced quite skillful interventions in terms of aggressive capital controls. It has also put cash on withdrawals to absorb any shock effect that was in the first weeks, where more than $10 billion were withdrawn just over the weekend. So that strengthening of the ruble was very important. But as I said, there has been now a couple of stages where interest rate has been lowered now from 20% in the first days of the war to 9% now. There's been gradual relaxation of what can be transferred and dealt in terms of hard currency. And the central bank governor, Elvina Nabiullina, is worried about the strengthening of the ruble. As I said, it doesn't serve well the Russian economy at all.
Okay, and I'd like to turn now back to Emily. So how does this feel for the average Russian when they go into the supermarket, when they go out to buy something? Where does this rise in prices actually affect the average person?
So a lot of experts are talking about how the effect on the Russian consumer and on Russian people will actually come later. So initially people were saying in the summer, now some people are saying more like in the autumn. I think initially, we were talking about price rises just after the war began. When that shock first started, prices went up, including on basic food goods like buckwheat, which is a favorite among Russians. But that may have been down to kind of panic buying. That's what a lot of people said, that was actually what was pushing the prices up. But of course, in the long term, Russia has been almost, very much cut off from the global economy, from its previous supply chains, and that means that certain things are going to vanish from the shelves, or are already vanishing from the shelves. There have been some shortages already. People have been complaining about price rises in medications, or even some medications vanishing. Again, it's still not quite clear whether that's because of panic buying or whether it's those supply chains. But I think we will find out soon what the effect on Russian people is, and I think people will start feeling it.
Okay, so there's more pain potentially to come. But I'd like to now hear from the man at the top. Last week, talking at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the Russian Davos, as some call it, President Putin blamed global inflation on the economic policies of the G7 countries, denying that his special operation, as he calls it, or as we would call it, the war in Ukraine, has anything to do with soaring prices of fuel and food worldwide. Take a listen.
Russia and our actions in Donbass have nothing to do with global instability. Today's inflation, problems with food security, fuel and the energy sector in general are the result of mistakes by the US administration and the EU bureaucracy. The world was driven into this situation by the irresponsible macroeconomic policy of the countries of the G7, including the uncontrollable emission and accumulation of unsecured debt.
So, Emily, he's right, isn't he? So not, of course, he started the war in Ukraine. That is entirely his fault. But Europe did a lot to connect its economy, its dependence on energy, dependence on foodstuffs that are grown in Russia. Europe brought them closer together. And I can think of one example from Germany, Angela Merkel's promotion of the Nord Stream pipeline as well. Her idea being, if we bring Russia into the boat, then they'll move towards a better, healthier democracy with Germany. But that failed. So in a way, Europe is to blame for this shock, this price shock that we found ourselves in. What do you think about that?
Well, certainly the idea that people like Angela Merkel supported, that if we keep talking to Russia and we keep trading with Russia, they'll kind of stay within the existing political order. That seems to have definitely backfired. And, you know, even now, the EU is very much dependent on Russia when it comes to gas imports. 40% of gas still comes from Russia in the EU. And of course, the EU has vowed to reduce that dependency, but that process will be slow. And Russia knows that. And I think at the moment what we're seeing is almost Russia throwing its weight around a little bit, you know, saying, we know that you need our gas. And, you know, we saw measures like, for example, the Russian gas giant Gazprom, which is largely state-owned, stopping gas exports to Bulgaria, to Poland, to Finland, saying, you know, we want to be paid in rubles, a condition which essentially they know that Europe can't fulfill. Then we also saw recently that gas supplies were reduced to Germany via Nord Stream 1, that pipeline. And there's always a sense, on the one hand, you know, you have the official justification from the Russians, which is usually a technical thing. You know, in the case of the Nord Stream, it was, you know, technical difficulties or contract difficulties. Yeah. But we know that there's a political dimension to this, of course, as well. And, you know, we heard Putin talking about Western economic policies being at fault. And there's very much a sense in Russia, I think, that the West has started a war with these sanctions against Russia. In his speech as well, Putin talked about an economic blitzkrieg against Russia. People keep saying that the West is Russophobic and that essentially the sanctions almost prove that the West is involved in Ukraine as well, and that Russia is fighting against the West in Ukraine on that front.
It's a bit rich when it comes from him that it's Europe's fault that they're in this situation. Of course, it was an act of aggression that if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't be in this situation at all anyway. So, you know, and, you know, these days we know that any country that seeks to just survive by itself, alone as an island, it doesn't work. You have to create and build bridges with other nations. And that's what Europe sought to do with Russia. But it seems to have, I guess, backfired in a way. We didn't have an exit plan, I guess, is the problem. But I'd like to turn to you again, Maria. As Europe weans itself off Russian oil and gas, you know, how hard is that expected to hit the Russian economy? Because so far they seem quite blasé about the whole situation and about the sanctions even. But as Europe turns off the taps from its end, is that going to hit Russia hard?
The absence of any energy sanctions has been the weakest spot of the current sanctions regime. We talked about unprecedented sanctions on freezing central bank assets, targeting Sberbank and other major financial institutions in Russia. But since the start of the war, Europe has sent over $60 billion to Russia. And this, in fact, contradicts the objective of sanctions, which is to erode Russia's ability to fund the war. So we are in a situation where Europe is in a very tight spot to find any alternatives, because it was just discussed. It was a comfortable situation, in particular for Germany, to tie itself to this energy bridge to Russia. It was cheap, it was convenient, infrastructure was there in place. There was less need to build new bridges, as you said, to other countries. So that path dependency remained for quite a while. Now Europe is in a situation where it needs to change it, but its lack of domestic resilience stops it from imposing gas embargo. So we heard that the EU announced an oil embargo. It's a major step up in terms of targeting the Russian economy. It receives, the oil sector has been a cash cow for the Russian economy, but it has also the mechanism that has been chosen is an embargo, phased out embargo that will be triggered in December. It has spiked the prices. So the Europe is eager to go that extra mile to find other suppliers, and in oil it's much easier to do. But also in terms of gas, it will be much difficult to do. And Russia knows that there is this very narrow time frame where it can weaponize energy supplies to Europe, in particular to Germany. And as was said, it cut the gas supplies via Nord Stream 1 by 60%. But in terms of the sanctions and hitting Russian economy, that is the key element that has been missing. But in terms of the design, we'll see the impact rather next year than this one.
Okay, so you think that certainly Europe could be doing a lot more by the sounds of it. And we'll talk about those other partners that could buy Russian oil a little bit later. But I'd like to turn back to you, Emily. You were nodding your head there. I mean, you've seen the criticism that's been levelled at Europe. They really should be doing more. Why aren't they doing more?
Well, because they were too dependent for too long. I mean, 40%, I was saying, 40% of EU gas is from Russia. That's a huge chunk. And it makes sense that it would take a while for them to wean themselves off that. And as I was saying, Russia knows that it has the upper hand there, I think.
OK, and Alexander asks for you, Maria. How can sanctions work if the EU is only going to stop buying oil by the new year? By then, Russia will already have redirected its oil routes to Asia. Is it as simple and as clear as that, Maria?
I don't think it's as simple as that, but there is certainly this time which is of the essence, not just for Ukraine when it fights Russian aggression, but also for Russia to reestablish this new supply chains to China, to India. And here there are two factors that needs to be taken into account. Is infrastructure bottlenecks, logistical challenges, and they're definitely there because India is miles away and doesn't have the established infrastructure. China is eager to take more Russian oil, but also there are new investments that are needed to put in place to ramp up those exports. And both countries, we should say, are very eager to capitalize on Russia's isolation. So the current discounts on Russian crude oil are rather unprecedented. It's more than $35 per barrel, whereas the Brent, the US Brent crude is traded around more than $110 per barrel. So Russia is exporting more to China and India, but at its own detrimental to its own budget. And also the second factor here is demand from those countries. Because China is, unlike the EU, which is 40% dependent on Russian gas, a bit less on oil, has the policy of diversification. It has a cap that no supplier, the share of any supplier should be more than 15%. So it's eager to keep those different countries, whether it's Russia or Saudi Arabia, in check. It doesn't want to put all eggs in one basket. So there is also limitations on the demand, how much those countries like China, also India, can import from Russia.
OK. And now just turning quickly back to you, Emily, we have a question from the boring millennial. Remember, fantastic username, by the way. And if you want to write in your questions, send them in, put them in the live chat, and we'll ask our experts here. They say, while Germany has returned to coal to make up for Russian gas, is there a serious plan towards more work and faster adoption of renewable energy sources like wind and solar in order to get off Russian gas? Where is Germany at with its mega energy transition, which, it's been a long time in the making?
Yeah, it's definitely a step backwards, that Germany, among other countries, is talking about returning to coal. We did hear Ursula von der Leyen from the EU talking about weaning the EU off Russian gas, and part of the plan there is also to switch to more renewables like solar and wind. But again, this is a long process. So I think the EU does want to do that, but they stayed reliant on Russian oil and gas, I think, for too long and didn't fulfill their green promises fast enough, I think.
Yeah, the EU has set this mega target to reduce dependence on Russian oil and gas, even though not all countries have signed up to all aspects. But that requires, at every single level, right down to the local level, everyone being on board. That sounds like a nightmare. Is it even realistic?
I don't know. I mean, there's always a bunch of infighting in the EU, people agreeing, disagreeing. Hungary has been known recently to block some measures as well. So I'm sure this will be a bit of a logistical nightmare. But hopefully, in the past few months, we have seen a fairly united Europe, considering united because of the war in Ukraine. So potentially this could also get people on one page, but we'll have to see, I guess.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see on that, that's for sure. Well, let's move on now. Russian authorities are keenly aware that if they want to increase domestic manufacturing, there has to be consumers to buy those products. And the head of the Russian central bank has called for more domestic consumption. Let's hear what she had to say.
Russia has earned a lot of foreign currency revenues from exports, but if there are only exports and no imports, Russia will be forced to put the money into risk-prone investments. Therefore, Russia needs to adjust its industrial structure by shifting to the domestic market, shoring up production, and revitalizing the manufacturing industry.
So, Maria, what does that mean, shifting to the domestic market? And how would that work?
That is, in fact, the key question. So despite all the hubristic statements at the forum that everything is fine, sanctions are not working, the key question was actually addressed in St. Petersburg. How to reform Russia's economic model and whether it can leapfrog from potential degradation to modernization against the background where the sanctions environment is tightening and the more than 1,300 companies are withdrawing from Russia. So how to build a new fundamental economy for Russia to survive all of this? And this question really needs to be addressed by Russian officials, whether they will be able to structurally transform it without really access to foreign capital, at least to Western capital, is a big question mark. Russia has been embarking on the policy of import substitution since 2014 to exactly address the problem of manufacturing on too much reliance on Western suppliers, and it hasn't achieved so much. And now we see that they can't even import nails or buttons, as was said by Russian officials, but more substantially advanced technologies for the energy sector, critical parts as chips and semiconductors. And those are the key items for any modern economies. So here it goes back to the previous question, whether non-aligned countries like China, India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia can step in and provide this capital. Because it's one thing to stabilize your financial system, but it's the other thing to allow this financial system to conduit, to process capital that is at the moment not there.
OK, Maria, I'd like to ask you another question that comes from Max, who's watching right now. Maybe this is a bit specialist, but I don't know what you can add on this. Who is going to service Russian airline fleets, basically? So if all of these sanctions are taking effect against specific industries, specific companies, cutting off these supply chains with the West that were just so essential before and so just taken for granted, what does Russia do now with this critical infrastructure that they have to maintain?
The aviation sector, on par with car industry, have been hit the most. And those are again, advanced parts and advanced critical materials that Russia doesn't produce domestically. So they are under a big task how to transform that industry. There have been anecdotal evidence that they would use the parts of the Romanian Western fleet and use it for its own. But again, going back to this import substitution, it has been a failure and a couple of delays in terms of producing homemade aviation fleet. Sukhoi Superjet that was meant to substitute American Boeing or Airbus didn't progress on time, on schedule, and now against this background of tightening export controls, the prospects are rather bleak for that.
OK, and what is it like for the chip industry? So we've seen that the whole world has struggled with chip supply chains, Maria, and you know, Russia is now going to be in an even worse situation. So it still has access to silicon chips, but perhaps not as well performant as what you might need to be able to keep up with the development of technology. How serious is that impact going to be? And I just want to say that comes from SIR, or Sir, our YouTube viewer who's watching. Maria, what do you think?
That is one of the key elements in the sanctions regime, on top with energy sanctions. Because by denying access to these chips and semiconductors, Russia is deprived, as Elvira Nabiullina, the central bank governor, described, will be forced to go reverse industrialization, meaning it will be relying more and more on less advanced technologies. And we already heard anecdotal evidence that Russia is using dishwasher chips for its military equipment. How much it's effective, I'm not a military expert to give you an expertise on that, but there is clearly a lack of this, and Russia cannot produce it domestically. Before the war, it used to ship it to Taiwan, who now joined sanctions regime. So Russia cannot even produce those chips domestically. They can produce Soviet-type chips, which are 20 years older, but this is not the modern economy, modern technology we're talking about.
Yeah, 20 years old chips are just not going to cut it, I'm afraid. But Emily, I'd like to turn back to you and ask you about the problem of brain drain. How serious is this issue?
Yeah, I was just going to add, first of all, though, to what Marius was saying about the aviation industry, there were also some reports that China has now offered to perhaps deliver some airplane parts to Russia if necessary. We'll see whether that comes to pass, but there have been some reports about that. When it comes to brain drain, I think that's an aspect to consider also when it comes to producing these microchips, along with, of course, the actual production facilities. That is a huge issue. I mean, we have heard figures from Russian authorities, essentially Russian bodies within the country, that between 50 to 70,000 IT experts have actually left the country since the beginning of the war. I mean, that is huge. And actually, we have seen also countries like Armenia, where a lot of people have gone, because there aren't visas, a lot of people who are against the war or who, didn't want to stay in the country. They're actually, trying to create a kind of Silicon Valley, including with some of the Russian experts, I think, even though they wouldn't say that they're trying to attract Russian experts, but I think that is something that is happening. So that could also, create problems going forward for the IT industry, I think, within Russia.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be a difficult time ahead for them because, I mean, we've seen the consequences of brain drain. In East Germany experienced that once the wall came up. It struggled to retain its talent and struggled for many decades because of that afterwards. And so if they don't have the chips and they don't have the programmers and the engineers to be able to put them in devices that matter, then it's going to have a serious effect. But that's the long-term effect. We're not seeing that acutely right now. But in the long term, that's going to really make an impact.
We heard also there was, Moscow Fashion Week recently. One designer was complaining, Maria mentioned it, that they don't have buttons, they don't have the right materials, textiles, because Russia just simply doesn't produce any of that.
Well, that's that's difficult. Though you never know when things get difficult. That might make be conducive to more creativity, I guess. That's the only good thing I could think of about that. But let's move on now. You mentioned China, so I'd like to pick up on these foreign partners a bit. Shunned by the Western bloc, Russia is increasingly looking at its partners in the BRICS group to revitalise its imports and exports and alleviate the hit from economic sanctions. Now, the BRICS acronym stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. The leaders of the 5 countries met on June the 23rd for the annual BRICS summit, organised in a virtual format by China. In his address, Russian President Vladimir Putin says he is rerouting trade and oil towards countries from the BRICS group of emerging economies. And Putin also commended the growing economic interchange within the BRICS, saying that trade within the bloc rose 35% in the first quarter of 2022 to $45 billion, a sentiment echoed by the Chinese President Xi Jinping, who reiterated some of Putin's talking points by calling unilateral sanctions a, quote, double-edged sword and a boomerang for the Western bloc. So, Emily, is there a perception that China, for example, it could be a natural ally for Russia, or is it a lot more complicated? I imagine it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, I would say, again, it's a bit of a mix. So I think China, in some ways, is an uneasy ally, but politically much more comfortable than the EU, even in the past, because China has never come out and criticized Russia's human rights record, which the various EU countries would always do when they visited Russia. China has also not condemned the war in Ukraine in such, clear terms, at least, and they also don't actually call it an invasion within the country. They also talk about, you were saying, they repeat some of the talking points that Putin also talks about, this double-edged sword. They also talk about the idea of a multipolar world order, so essentially something that's against the U.S. dominance within the world, including within the economy. But I think, Russia has been trying to pivot towards Asia since around 2013. That was what they said back then. That's almost 10 years ago. And still, up until the war, the EU was always the main trade partner for Russia. China was second, but the EU was always the main trade partner. And now it seems like they might be forced, but there was always a sense before that, China for Russia was almost some sort of a sense of, there was some sort of a sense of fear around that. They share a long land border. They've fought in the past. There was a bit of an unease there. And when it comes to China, I think they saw Russia simply as too small of an economic fish to really, make one of their main trade partners. So I think there's some difficulties there, but we are seeing some movement when it comes to China. After the International Economic Forum in St. Petersburg, they announced that they would be that there were new trade agreements. We don't have that much detail on them between China and Russia. So there does seem to be some movement, at least rhetorically, and I think Russia kind of doesn't have a choice anymore.
Yeah, and it's going to be a very different relationship with China than Russia had with the EU. And that might not be an ideal situation for Putin. It might not make him look very good.
Too reliable,
Yeah, too reliant on China as the main consumer of its goods, perhaps. So, Maria, I think you might be able to jump in on this one as well. Sylvester asks here, can India afford to move away from Russia? So I imagine he's talking here about, whether India is going to have issues with its reputation with other previously friendly countries if it buys up Russian oil, perhaps, because there was the discussion about being able to sell Russian oil at a discount to India to get it on side. What do you make of this relationship with Russia and India, and perhaps the other BRICS countries and foreign partners as well? What are Russia's options here?
It is true that so far all eyes have been on China to assess how much it can help out this partner in need, sanctions partner in need. But we know, if just joining the previous discussion, that China has been very cautious not to violate the Western sanctions, because it's so much dependent on US dollar transactions that it's eager to capitalize on Russia's isolation, but to violate Western sanctions in an outright fashion, private sector always overcomplied with Western sanctions. In a way, India is an interesting country here because it has been even more assertive than China. It has showed more support. It has been rhetorically also towing this delicate line and claiming neutrality, and also not supporting Ukrainian calls to join the sanctions regime. But at the moment, India is also a key country here to watch in terms of how much New Delhi can mitigate any impact of sanctions, the existing one, but also the future ones. And the oil embargo is the key one here to assess, because India has ramped up by more than 25-fold in terms of importing Russian oil. And that is unprecedented for India, that only imported 1% of Russian oil in the past. So it's happy to import this cheap Russian crude, despite all of the discounts, despite all of the logistical problems, but it's happy to capitalize it at the moment. So far, the threat of secondary sanctions didn't dissuade India not to capitalize on that. But going forward, the US will be more bold in terms of threatening India. So far, they've used carrot approach towards New Delhi, forging new military deals with the country. But the more it capitalizes and uses these opportunities, there will be more threats of secondary sanctions. But in terms of balancing out China, and as it was said, Russia will be much more dependent on China than ever before. The asymmetrical relationship existed before, that now it will be really skewed towards China. China will dictate all of the deals. So India represents an important hedging for Russia, but in terms of its economic clout, it just can't cut it. It just can't really balance it. It's an important for Russia to have this external partner, also other BRIC countries, Brazil, South Africa, but China will be the country to support Russia in this.
It's going to be a massive shift, a massive change, that's for sure. And Sylvester, thank you very much for your question. And if you have any more questions that you'd like to send in, just put them in the live chat box and we'll ask our experts here as well. And Emily, I've got a question for you. Duncan here says, BRICS does not need Russia, and this new course of action will do nothing. But is that true? Is it that simple? Do all of these nations, Brazil, South Africa, China, India, and so on, do they need Russia, or is it much more the other way around, that Russia has to be able to, let's say, cut some deals, perhaps take some hits in order to offer themselves up to these other countries to find some friendly nations in the world that will work with them and ones with significant economic heft behind them?
Well, I think, Russia
Sorry,
certainly...
It's a big question.
Yeah,
Massive,
big question.
Impossible question to answer, but I'm going to give it to you.
Russia, absolutely is in kind of a vulnerable position, even though we wouldn't know it listening to Vladimir Putin and the rhetoric coming out of Moscow. But they are looking for new partners and to strengthen relationships, including with the BRICS countries. I think that even before, but now especially since the war, Vladimir Putin has been emphasizing the importance of formats such as the BRICS. And part of that also started earlier. Maria was talking about the fact that sanctions have been affecting the Russian economy since 2014. And a lot of what we've seen, this sort of pivot to import substitution, and also the pivot to talking about the importance of BRICS, the importance of other partners, the idea of pivoting to Asia, that all is kind of linked up, I think, with the sanctions. And that has been a trend that Russia, within its foreign policy has been kind of pursuing for some time. But of course, there's a lot more urgency to that trend now. So I think, yes, probably right now, Russia needs the other countries more than they need it. But, Russia's economy is important, at least when it comes to oil and resources for the world.
Yeah, we do need to put this in the context of what happened in 2014 with Russia's first invasion of Ukraine. And what's happened since then. So we tend to think about the big date as being in February. That's when the invasion happened, but it's actually been quite a long time coming by the looks of it. And certainly Russia has tried to pivot itself accordingly. But we're getting close to the end now. So I want to come back to this thought of sanctions. And so, Emily, what do you think? Here's Tony has said, with 30 affluent Western countries sanctioning Russia, and just Russia by itself sanctioning the West, all by itself, it is obvious, says Tony, that Russia will lose. My question is, how long until normal Russians feel it for real? Because at the moment, like you said, the optimism is slightly coming back up again. When are they going to feel the consequences of all of these sanctions hitting, of oil and gas revenue being cut off, of these Western countries leaving, supply chains, all of these things we've talked about? When's it going to hit home?
The effect, I think, is trickling in bit by bit. Maria was talking about the central bank taking measures to stabilize the Russian economy that have been pretty successful. The IMF predicts that the Russian economy this year will shrink by around 8% to 9%. Russian figures at the moment also predict around that number. So, that's pretty significant. The thing is, for Russian consumers or for Russian people, wages for them have been falling for years now. Things are getting worse. The Russian government has taken some measures within the country to at least kind of reach out to their core, to Putin's core supporters. So they've instituted some measures that are coming in June and July to raise pensions, to raise the living wage, and to kind of create a little bit of at least a sense of economic stability. How long it will take for those sanctions to hit, I think, is probably more of a question to Maria as the expert here when it comes to the figures on the economy.
Well, I would like to ask Maria about that, because it is, you're absolutely right. In fact, we have a couple of questions here as well, which, Maria, you might be able to answer. Perhaps slightly more philosophical than economic technical. But let's see how you feel about them. So BB says, have sanctions in the world ever worked really well? Because we have seen sanctions fail in the past. And some could say we certainly haven't got the short-term effect that Europe had expected. And then Glenn says, Russia is spending close to $1 billion a day on its disastrous war against Ukraine. How long will the Russian people support this criminal war? And what is Russia's exit strategy? That's Glenn, who's watching us right now. What do you think, Maria?
That is the key question, the quintessential question, whether sanctions are working. And we need to unpack that word working, what we mean under this. And that goes back to the objective of sanctions. This time is a slight lower objective, if you want. It's not about the behavioral change in the Kremlin. It's not about changing Putin's calculus on this. It's about eroding Russia's ability to fund the war, right? So the energy sanctions here are very much the key to target it. When it will trickle down, and here the discussion usually pivots towards the macroeconomics, whether we see, GDP contracting, is it 9% or 15% as was originally predicted. And it's part of the sanctions analysis, but it's also sanctions are often about microeconomics, disruption of supply chains, that you cannot access capital in the West. It's things that are trickling down and they are accumulating over time. So the long-term perspective here is very important to keep in mind. And for the Russian government, as we said, it's important to keep this perspective, this narrative that nothing has changed. So inflation, curbing inflation is important, raising wages is important, but this will have to happen in a situation where the economic pie is shrinking. So far, the social contract between the Russian government and its population was, we provide you relatively good living standards for post-Soviet countries, and you don't interfere in the politics. This social contract has been tensing, has been straining, wearing very thinly. When this fear will turn into anger, it's very hard to predict. It's probably the question to sociologists as any economist or political scientist. But the strains will be there because you will have to chip in for people in poverty, in households that has been already feeling the pressure from this shrinking pie since 2014, and whether the Russian government will have enough capital to cover all of the tables, all of the stocks is the main question here.
Okay, well, that was a fantastically detailed and wonderfully economic answer to a philosophical question. But of course, you get that from an economist. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. And that brings us nicely, actually, to the end. So that's all for this Q&A, looking at the situation for the Russian economy. And I'd like to thank our guests as well. Emily Sherwin, our former Moscow correspondent, and thank you very much for coming in and speaking with us about that. Thanks. Absolutely fantastic. And Maria Shagina of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin, who is joining us from Zurich. Maria, thank you very much as well. And if you've enjoyed the stream, stick around on our YouTube channel and check out some of our other videos as well. And I can highly recommend our Business Beyond series if you want more topics like this one. From the whole team here in Berlin, thank you very much for watching. So,
the Ukrainian government says Russia has launched a wave of airstrikes aimed at the country's civilian infrastructure. Reports suggest most missiles have been intercepted by air defense systems, but some have hit locations in the region of Lutsk, Rivne, Khmelnytsky and Cherskiy. 5 missiles fired at the capital, Kiev, were shot down, according to an advisor to the president's office. Ukraine's energy distribution company said it would limit electricity supply in several regions, including Kiev, while power outages have been reported across the country. Let's get the latest with our correspondent in Kiev, Hugo Bichega. Hugo, bring us up to date.
Yes, Samantha, another morning of Russian attacks targeting the country's electricity grid. We're getting reports of attacks across the country. In the central city of Cherkasy, critical infrastructure was hit. The entire city is now without power. And in the port city of Odessa, 3 people have been injured, again after infrastructure was hit. Villages across the region of Odessa in the south of the country are now without power. And in the western city of Lutsk, away from the front lines, 1 person was injured after another energy facility was hit. And we're getting reports of blackouts across the country. This morning, the energy distribution company said it would limit electricity supply to several regions of Ukraine, including here, the capital, Kiev. And this seems to be part of Russia's strategy here in Ukraine to damage the country's electricity infrastructure ahead of winter. Officials here say more than a third of the country's power stations have been hit in recent weeks, and restrictions on electricity consumption have been introduced across the country. As officials say, it is going to take time to repair the damage. And we had reaction from the head of the president's office, Andrei Yermak, to this latest wave of Russian attacks. He said Russia was fighting against civilian infrastructure and people, and that Ukrainians are getting angrier by the day, and that this means they will give an even stronger answer. And this is the feeling that I get, the reaction that I get when I talk to people here in Kiev. There's no panic, there's no fear, but only anger that civilian sites, civilian infrastructure have become the target.
Okay, Hugo in Kiev for now. Thank you.
Der Krieg in der Ukraine verursacht nicht nur menschliches Leid in ungeahntem Ausmaß, er hat auch Auswirkungen auf Natur und Klima. Warum genau? Und warum würden Lösungen in der Klimafrage genau dort liegen, im Schutz und der Kraft der Natur nämlich? Jetzt in ZIP Magazin Klima. Durch Explosionen, verseuchte Böden, verschmutztes Grundwasser, brennende Wälder. Die Ukraine war bekannt für wertvolle Ökosysteme, für von Menschen unberührte Urwälder. Laut einem Bericht der OECD hat das russische Militär aber schon bis zum Sommer rund 900 Naturschutzgebiete in der Ukraine beschädigt. Rund ein Drittel aller Schutzgebiete der Ukraine leidet unter dem Krieg. Eine Fläche größer als Oberösterreich.
Der Krieg hat einen beachtlichen Einfluss aufs Klima. Vor allem verlagert er die Aufmerksamkeit weg vom Klimaschutz. Das ist fürs Erste die größte Gefahr.
Aber es gibt auch konkretere Effekte. Waldbrände haben sich in der Ukraine durch Kriegsmaterial gegenüber 2021 verdoppelt. Das beschossene Azov-Stahlwerk, Chemiewerke, Raffinerien, Brände, die in großen Mengen CO2 und Methan ausstoßen, genauso wie die Lecks in den zerstörten Ostsee-Pipelines massiv klimaschädliches Methan freigeben. Was an Infrastruktur, Gebäuden, Städten zerstört wird, muss mit neuem Stahl und Zement wieder aufgebaut werden. Baustoffe, deren Produktion massiv CO2 ausstößt. Außerdem machen Russland, Weißrussland und die Ukraine zusammen ein Viertel des weltweiten Holzhandels aus. Russland und die Ukraine mehr als ein Viertel der Produktion von Weizen. Auch der Großteil der Düngemittel kommt aus dieser Region.
Ein Nebeneffekt ist auf jeden Fall, dass der Krieg natürlich andernorts auf der Welt die Ausbeutung von Böden und Wäldern beschleunigen wird, im panischen Versuch, die hohen Preise oder ausbleibende Lebensmittel und Düngemittel zu kompensieren.
Auch die Ukraine hat geschützte Wälder zur Schlägerung freigegeben, um Geld für den Krieg zu verdienen. Dabei müsste es gerade andersrum sein. Bis heute unberührte Natur braucht mehr Schutz denn je, denn nur so schützt sie uns, den Menschen.
Ungefähr die Hälfte der gesamten Landmasse weltweit wurden für landwirtschaftliche Flächen, Städte, Infrastruktur umgegraben. Die andere Hälfte ist einigermaßen intakte Natur. Letzteres eine gewaltige Kohlenstoffsenke. Bis zu einem Viertel all unserer Brennemissionen durch Gas, Öl, Kohle werden von diesen Böden, Wäldern und so weiter aufgenommen. Diese Senken müssen wir schützen.
Der Direktor des Potsdam-Instituts für Klimafolgenforschung, Johann Rockström, hat an einem weltweiten Fahrplan mitgewirkt, der den massiven Schutz natürlicher Prozesse als unabdingbar einfordert.
Wenn wir nur ein Fünftel der weltweiten Böden, Wälder und so weiter nachhaltig bewirtschaften würden, wäre das eine Einsparung an Treibhausgasen, wie wenn wir 1,7 Milliarden Autos von der Straße bekommen. Das wäre eine massive Umwälzung.
Es bräuchte wieder nachhaltigere Methoden der Landwirtschaft wie früher, ein Weg von Monokulturen hin zu natürlichem Wuchs an Vielfalt.
Am vielversprechendsten, um Kohlenstoff nicht in die Atmosphäre zu bringen, sondern zu binden, ist in der Landwirtschaft, dass man aufhört zu pflügen, auf minimale Bodenbearbeitung umstellt. Pflügen ist konventionelle Landwirtschaft. Wenn man den Boden umgräbt, gerät organisches Material mit Wasser und Sonne in Berührung. Man verbrennt Kohlenstoff. Bleibt der Boden ungestört, dann wird auf organische Art schnell Kohlenstoff gebunden. Kein Pflügen und mehr Grün bindet massiv Kohlenstoff.
Auch das Auslaufen von Glyphosat ohne Ausnahmen bis Ende des Jahres und die Halbierung von Pflanzenschutzmitteln bis 2030 sind dringliches Thema.
Bäume und Sträucher mitten auf landwirtschaftlichen Feldern, nicht immer die gleichen Nutzpflanzen, sondern verschiedenste Fruchtfolgen, eine gute Balance aus Weideland und Acker, all das hilft, auch wenn es kein Allheilmittel ist. Wir müssen beides machen. Wir müssen raus aus Kohle, Öl und Gas und mit der Natur arbeiten.
Während der Krieg auf der einen Seite auch Natur zerstört, braucht diese auf der anderen Seite eine ganz neue Art von Schutz. Dann kann sie die Erderhitzung einbremsen und uns wie bisher einigermaßen vor Gefahren schützen. Bis zur nächsten Woche.